Fame and Fortune Weekly. Stories of Boys Who Make Money. Number 19, New York, February 9th, 1906. Published by Frank Tousey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Keith Salis. A Rise in Life, or the Career of a Factory Boy, by a Self-Made Man. Chapter 1. Ruby Norton. "No, you shan't walk me home, Dexter Pritchard," exclaimed pretty and spirited Ruby Norton decidedly. "Why not?" demanded the well-dressed youth who, cane in hand, confronted the girl on the walk in front of the Bayport Woolen Mills, where she was employed as an operative. "Because I don't wish you to." "You put on a lot of frills for a mill hand," replied young Pritchard in a disagreeable tone. "I should think you'd be glad to be seen walking with me." "Well, I'm not, so there." And she made a move to pass him. "Hold on, I want to talk to you," said Dexter, barring her way. "But I don't want to talk to you. I want to go home," she replied, a flush mounting to her face. "Then let me walk along with you," he persisted, giving his natty little cane a twirl. "No," she answered, flashing a defiant look at him. Dexter Pritchard wasn't accustomed to being crossed in his desires, and he showed it in the petulant way he received the girl's reply. He was an only son and a spoiled boy. His father, Duncan Pritchard, was president and chief stockholder of the Bayport Woolen Mills. He was the best-dressed boy in that thriving little New England town. He had plenty of money to spend on his own pleasures, was accorded a great deal more respect than he deserved, because his father was looked upon as the great man of the neighborhood, and what he didn't think of himself would have been hard to discover. Ruby Norton was the prettiest as well as spunkiest girl in Bayport. There was nothing deceptive about Ruby. If she liked a person, she showed it. That's why she and Bob Chambers, a curly-headed and good-looking mill hand of 17, were such excellent friends. If she didn't like a person, she took no great trouble to conceal the fact. She didn't like Dexter Pritchard, even if he was known to have money to burn and his father practically owned the establishment where she put in 6 long days every week for far from princely wages. And that was all there was to it. Dexter Pritchard, on the contrary, was impressed with Ruby's good looks and piquant ways, and he wanted to monopolize her society when he felt so disposed. He couldn't see any reason why she shouldn't regard his attentions as a distinguished honor, and it was a disagreeable surprise for him to discover that the girl didn't look at it in that light. "Don't you know I can have you fired from the mill if I have a mind to, Ruby Norton?" snarled Dexter, growing warm under the collar at her persistent refusal to permit him to enjoy the satisfaction he coveted. "You wouldn't dare!" cried the girl indignantly. "How do you know I wouldn't?" he retorted, thinking to bring her to her knees with this threat. "Because it would be a contemptible thing for you to try to do," she replied with flaming cheeks. "Then don't make me do it," he said pointedly. "Make you do it?" she flashed back scornfully. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Dexter Pritchard. You, the son of the president of the company, to try to force your society upon me, a mill girl, against my wishes. If I told you what I think of your conduct, you wouldn't like it." "You're a little fool," snorted the nabob's son angrily. "Thank you for the compliment," she said disdainfully. "People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones." "What do you mean by that?" he asked suspiciously. "I mean just what I said," she answered, with an independent toss of her shapely head. "Please allow me to pass." She stepped around him with the air of a little queen, and was several yards away before he recovered from his discomfiture. "Yeah, you think you can wipe your feet on me, do you, Ruby Norton?" muttered the boy with a burst of passion. "Well, I'll see about it. I'll make you pay dearly for all these airs you put on. I'll have you fired from your job as sure as I stand here. So you wouldn't let me see you home, but you let that beggar Chambers escort you to and from night school regularly. You prefer a common mill hand to me. That shows a little sense you have. There isn't another girl in the mill but would fall all over herself to secure the honor I have just afforded you. I'll fix you, Miss Ruby. You'll wish you hadn't insulted Dexter Pritchard." He shook his cane threateningly at her retreating figure, and then turned on his heel and walked away in the opposite direction. As he left the scene, a small gate in the fence, which had been standing open an inch, creaked on its rusty hinges, and a shock of bright red hair appeared. Underneath was a grinning, freckled face, in which were a pair of particularly bright eyes. The eyes followed the figure of Dexter Pritchard until he disappeared around a corner into Main Street. "You're a nice chap, you are, I don't think," muttered the watcher, whose name was Andy Ball. He was employed in the engine room of the mill, and was a particular friend of Bob Chambers. Pritchard had uttered his sentiments in a tone loud enough for Andy, who had been behind the gate from the moment Dexter had intercepted Ruby Norton on her way home, to overhear. Andy liked Ruby, too, in an unselfish way, but he well knew he wasn't in it with Bob, and he was too loyal a friend to get disgruntled over the matter. "You mean to fix Ruby, do you?" continued Andy, shutting the gate and walking slowly back to the engine room, pushing an empty wheelbarrow in which he had been carrying ashes to the dump. "You're jealous 'cause she won't have nothing to do with you. It would suit your little mean nature to get her discharged from the mill. It don't make no difference to you, I guess, if her father is down sick in bed and there ain't nothing coming into the house but what she earns. Like to see 'em all starve, wouldn't you, you pesky young dude? What do you want with Ruby, anyway? She isn't in your class. You want the earth, don't you? Well, don't you do nothing to her, or there'll be something doing you won't like. Me and Bob won't stand for any harm coming to her from nobody, bet your life." And the boy shook his shock head in a very positive and defiant way. "Hello, Andy. What are you muttering about and shaking your head like a mechanical Chinese mandarin for?" said a cheery voice at his elbow. Andy looked around and found that Bob Chambers had come up unperceived and was regarding him with a mischievous smile. "Oh, it's you, is it?" "I don't know that it's anybody else," chuckled Bob. "What are you kicking about anyway, old man?" "It wouldn't make you feel any too happy if I told you." "Oh, well, I'm mixed up in it, eh?" "No, but Ruby is, and I know what that means to you." "What about Ruby? Has anything happened to her?" cried Bob, gripping Andy by the arm, while a look of apprehension flew into his face. "No, nothing's happened to her so far." "So far? What do you mean by that?" "I suppose I've got to tell you. That dude, Dexter Pritchard, has been annoying her." "When?" cried Bob hotly. "Don't get excited. It's all over." "I want to know all about it. What's he been up to?" "When the mill shut down half an hour ago, he was outside the fence yonder waiting for her." "He was, eh? How do you happen to know that, Andy?" "'Cause I seen him near the side gate when I poked my head out after wheeling this load of ashes over to the dump. I wondered what he was doing there, so I kept my eye on him. In a few minutes along came Ruby all by herself. He stepped right up and spoke to her. She answered him politely, and was going on again when he planked himself in front of her." "He did?" "That's what he did. He wanted to walk home with her. He's got nerve. Ruby wouldn't have it all right, and that made him mad. He tried to make her give in, but you know how spunky she is. When she doesn't want to do anything, you can't make her nohow." "That's so," grinned Bob, who had had a varied experience with the girl himself, and he rather admired that quality in her. "When he found out he could not have his way with her, he threatened her." "He did what?" roared Bob, instinctively doubling up his fists. "He threatened to have her thrown out of the mill." "You heard him say that?" "I heard him plain enough. He meant that as a bluff, of course." "No, he didn't mean it as a bluff. He meant it in right down earnest." "Are you sure he did?" "Yes, I'm sure he did." "Why are you so sure?" "'Cause after she left him I heard him speaking to himself. He shook that dude cane at her and said he'd get square with her, and he wasn't fooling for a cent. He's down on her now like 1,000 of bricks. He's got pull enough to make all kinds of trouble for her, and he's mean enough to do it, too." Bob looked troubled. He knew well enough what that would mean for Ruby. If she was discharged from the mill upon some trumped-up pretext, the Norton family, which relied on her to keep the wolf from the door, would be brought face to face with actual want. "Ogden Wells, the manager, is a square man," said Bob. "He wouldn't discharge her without cause." "I hope he wouldn't," replied Andy. "But he isn't the whole thing." "Yes, he is, so far as running the business is concerned. No one has any right to interfere with the details of his management, not even Mr. Pritchard. He's the boss of the mill. He takes his orders from the president, it is true, but they relate only to general conduct of the business. He is responsible for the economical production of the fruit of the loom." "Fruit of the loom is good," grinned Andy. "That's poetical, isn't it?" "Maybe it is. I heard our night school teacher use the expression the other evening, and I thought it fitted the case pretty well." "Then you think the manager wouldn't be in no hurry to fire Ruby?" said Andy with a look of relief. "I am sure he wouldn't." "Not even if Dexter Pritchard was to ask him?" "Certainly not." "Or his father?" "Duncan Pritchard would hardly suggest such a thing to the manager unless he had some very strong reasons." "Then Dexter'll try to do her some other way." "Not if I can help it, he won't," said Bob resolutely. "And me too," chimed in Andy. "He'll find his work cut out if he tries any games against Ruby, for she is the pet of the mill. There isn't a man here but would take her part, and the girls too, for that matter." "Bet your life," said Andy, taking up his barrow again. "You're going home now, ain't you, Bob?" "Yes." "I'll see you tonight, then. So long." Andy wheeled away, and Bob cut across the yard and let himself out by the side gate. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. A Hint of Coming Trouble. "Mother, I smell pork and beans," cried Bob Chambers as he rushed into the small kitchen of the little cottage where the Chambers family lived on the outskirts of Bayport, grabbed his mother around the waist, and gave her a hug and a kiss. "Why, what a bear you are!" smiled the little woman, looking proudly at her stalwart son. "Well, I'm hungry as one at any rate," replied the boy, turning the faucet in the sink and proceeding to give his bright young face a good sousing. "Supper is all ready and waiting," said Mrs. Chambers. "I'll tell you, those beans smell good. They hit my weak spot. I suppose Hattie is home?" "She's been in an hour." Hattie Chambers gave music lessons on the piano to a dozen odd pupils in the town, and in this way added materially to the family income, so that the Chambers lived very comfortably indeed in their own modest home, which Mr. Chambers had bought and paid for during his lifetime. Bob's sister was watering the flowers at the dining room window when he entered with a shine on his face which showed he had been using the crash towel with considerable vigor. He sneaked up behind, put his hands over her eyes, pulled her head back, and yelled, "Gus!" into her ear. "You ridiculous boy!" cried the girl. "I'll sprinkle you with water." He kissed her with a loud smack, grabbed her by the arms, and began to waltz her around the room. "Aren't you just awful?" she cried, struggling to release herself. "What's the use of having a sister if you don't show her some attention?" he said, letting her go and dropping into his accustomed seat at the table. "Do you know, sis, I like you just a shade better than I do pork and beans." "I suppose you wish me to take that as a compliment?" she said laughingly. "Sure, it's a compliment," he said, helping himself to a liberal allowance of his favorite dish. "You wouldn't say that to Ruby Norton," she replied as she took her own seat. "How do you know I wouldn't?" he said with a rising color. "Oh, I know," she answered archly. "Ruby and I are the best of friends, and we haven't any secrets from each other." "I don't wonder. A girl couldn't keep a secret to save her life." "The idea! I'll tell Ruby what you said. See if I don't." "Of course you will. Didn't I just say you couldn't keep a thing to yourself?" "Mother, will you listen to Bob?" "You mustn't mind what he says. He likes to tease you," said Mrs. Chambers, who was pouring out the tea. "This is fine buttered toast, all right," said Bob with his mouth full. "Your sister made it," said his mother. "Did she? Oh, well, you're all to the mustard, Hat. If you want a testimonial any time, just call on me." "You're too good. By the way, don't jump out of your shoes with sudden joy, but Ruby promised to take tea with us tomorrow evening, and then we'll all go to the meeting together. "You don't say!" exclaimed Bob in a pleased tone. "I don't want you to run off with my cologne bottle like you did the last time she was here. Do you understand, sir?" "I shan't want your old cologne. I'm going to buy a bottle of Jockey Club for my own particular use. And let me remind you not to sneak it out of my room when Parker Jewett comes calling on you again." "Why, the idea! Just as if I would!" cried Hattie, blushing like a June rose. "Well, there's no telling what you girls would do when there's a bow in the wind," grinned Bob. "Mother, will you make him stop teasing me?" "I'm not saying a word," said Bob, sober as a judge, but with a twinkle in his hazel eyes. "Just you wait till Ruby comes," threatened his sister. "Well, what then?" "I'll tell her about the way you've got her picture displayed on your bureau, with a true lover's knot of baby blue ribbon pinned to the bottom of it, and how I caught you kissing—" "Hattie Chambers, if you dare give me away like that, I won't do a thing to you," cried Bob with a red face. laughed the girl. "All right, you see, I'm going to tell Parker Jewett." "Now, Bob, you're not going to tell him a thing about me. You wouldn't dare." "Then don't you say anything to Ruby." "You know she wouldn't say a word, Robert," interposed his mother. "She'd better not," replied Bob, wagging his curly head suggestively. After supper, Andy came around, and the two boys went off together. It was Saturday evening, and there was no night school to attend. They were members of the Bayport Social Club, which had a modest room on the second floor of a frame building adjoining the engine house of Hercules No. 1 on Main Street. About 20 boys were connected with the organization, all of them employed in various Bayport industries. During the winter they gave entertainments and dances in the town hall. They had a football 11 and a baseball 9, both of which were strong enough to make things interesting for similar teams in adjoining towns. Bob Chambers was the president and the most popular member. Parker Jewett, who was sweet on Hattie Chambers, was secretary. Andy Ball was sergeant-at-arms. The latest addition to the club, and newest arrival in Bayport, was a young German named Jake Switzer. He dropped off a train one morning, applied at the mill for work, and got it. He was a good mechanic, thoroughly acquainted with woolen machinery, and the manager soon came to regard him as a valuable addition to the establishment. When Bob and Andy reached the club room, they found Jake waiting for somebody to open up. "Good evenings. I've been waiting around 15 minutes for one of you chaps to come by the places, so that I got in," said Switzer as Andy produced his key. "You're an early bird," replied Bob. "I bet you," grinned Jake. "I got me a little job on head." "What kind of job?" "You didn't found out already yet that I was porn sign painter, no?" "A sign painter?" exclaimed Bob and Andy in a breath after the three had entered the club room. "Sure thing. You see those pieces of cardboard?" said Jake, taking half a dozen from under his arm. "We couldn't miss 'em," grinned Bob. "They're big enough." "Well, listen. I paint them things on them for Bimbler, the grocer." He drew a chair up to the table, took a small paint box from his pocket, which bore a German trademark, filled a cup with water, and began operations under the curious and interested gaze of his two clubmates. That Switzer was an artist in this line was soon apparent. In the center of the first card he painted a large egg. "Gee!" exclaimed Andy. "That looks natural enough to pick up. If a hen saw that egg, she would want to set on it right away." "I bet you she would," replied Jake. "Once upon times I painted a nest mit 6 eggs in it, und laid it on the grass to dry. Und the duck come by, and sat on the picture, and hatched out 6 chickens." "That's pretty good for you, Switzer," said Bob. "But if I were you, I wouldn't tell it too often." "Why not?" beginning to letter the words "fresh eggs" in a semicircle over the egg. "It might excite some doubt in the minds of your hearers as to its verisimilitude." Jake stopped work and looked at Bob. "Excuse me, but where did you found that expressions?" "In the dictionary. Suppose you told me what it means." "It means probability or the appearance of truth." "Is that so? Maybe that's a polite way to call me a liar, ain't it?" "Oh, no. Only you oughtn't to stretch the truth so far. By the way, why don't you make that read fresh laid eggs?" For why? Everybody knows their eggs was fresh when they was laid. Exactly. And that's all it's safe for Bilmer to say about them. Well, that got me nothings to do with how long the eggs been laid. I make me the signs to suit Bimler. At any rate, the sign was a peach when he had finished it, and the boys praised it highly. They told me that you have a new baby in your house, Andy, ain't it? Said Jake, beginning a new sign about Smyrna figs. That's right. And he's a cuckoo for fair. Did you name him after his father? No, grinned Andy, nudging Bob in the ribs. We named him after a prolonged scrap in which the whole family engaged. Is that so? So Bimler keeps Smyrna figs, eh? Said Bob. I bet you he does, said Jake, putting the finishing touches on a bunch of the luscious fruit. I thought he sold them. Why not? How can he keep them and sell them at the same time? Chuckled Bob. Ha ha ha! Gurgled Andy. Ho ho ho! Repeated Jake sarcastically. That don't been funny for a gobber cent. I told you something's better as that. You saw me working around the engine room today. Yes, admitted Andy. I saw you all right. You were doing something to the top of the boiler. I found me out somethings about the boilers. What did you find out? Asked Andy with a look of interest. I found out that it was hottest when it was cold. Suffer and juice harps, cried Andy, falling back in Bob's arms. Just then a bunch of newcomers appeared in the room, among them Parker Jewett. Of course, they all wanted to see what Switzer was doing, and one and all declared him to be a wonder. Just before the meeting was called to order, Jewett took Bob aside. I'm afraid there's going to be trouble at your factory. In what way? Asked Bob in surprise. There's going to be a meeting of the stockholders next week. My father is one, you know. And Duncan Pritchard intends to insist on a general reduction of wages. As there's been a 10% cut already, I'm afraid the hands won't stand for it. What do you think? I think there'll be something doing, replied Bob with a sober face. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 The Stockholders' Meeting. Apparently nothing came of Dexter Pritchard's threat to have Ruby Norton discharged from the mill. If he had made the attempt, it was unsuccessful. Bob Chambers and Andy Ball were a bit anxious for 3 days. Then they came to the conclusion that Ruby was safe enough. In the meantime, it had come to be known from one end of the big mill to the other that another reduction in the wages of all the employees was contemplated. At least Duncan Pritchard, who controlled so much stock that he was a ruling power in the corporation, was known to have such a plan on foot. 6 months before, the mill hands had submitted, with very bad grace, to a cut of 10% on the company's plea of overproduction. The stockholders were to meet Wednesday afternoon and consider the matter. The mill hands were thoroughly organized, and the general impression in town was that they would resist any reduction tooth and nail. On Wednesday at 2 p.m., the stockholders gathered in the large parlor of Mr. Pritchard's sumptuous residence overlooking the bay. The president called the meeting to order. Duncan Pritchard was a big, fleshy man, with a fat face ornamented with a pair of light-hued side whiskers, always carefully brushed, while his little eyes were sunk deeply under beetling brows. He dressed in the finest of broadcloth, with a massive gold chain swung across his vest from pocket to pocket, and his manner was always that of a man on excellent terms with the world. "Gentlemen," he began in his consequential way, "I have called you together to consider a matter of vital interest to our corporation, namely, the advisability of making another and more decided cut in the wages of our employees. I find, gentlemen, that the market is suffering from an overplus of the manufactured article, and that we are no longer able to obtain the prices that we ought to get for our finished product. Therefore, gentlemen, unless we are prepared to submit to a reduction of our customary 6% semi-annual dividend, we must cheapen the cost of production. Mr. Wells and myself have gone exhaustively into the subject, and the only effective way we see out of the difficulty is to reduce wages all along the line. You hear, gentlemen?" Reduce wages, say, 15%. I shall now be glad to learn your views upon the subject." The stockholders looked at one another in an undecided way. It was a full minute before any one of them made a move. Then Mr. Jewett got up and said, "Gentlemen, I am not in favor of this proposed reduction in the wages of our employees. With due deference to the opinion of our worthy president, I think he has unconsciously exaggerated the situation. While it is true that times are not quite as prosperous with us as they were a year ago, I don't think, judging from the figures submitted to us by our manager, Mr. Wells, that a cut of 15% in wages is necessary at this time, nor, I may say, do I think it at all advisable. Our employees have already been compelled to accept a reduction of 10%, and even that is a serious matter with men who have large families. I could mention several cases that have come to my notice, where children have been taken from school and sent to work in the mill since the cut in question was put through. I hope, gentlemen, that you understand the gravity of this matter. Employees have rights that we ought to respect. Before we make a decided move in this thing, we ought to inquire whether this proposed cut may not be a real hardship for our intelligent and faithful workers. A cut in wages is always a serious problem, and I trust you will weigh the question well before committing yourselves to it." While Mr. Jewett was addressing the meeting, Duncan Pritchard frowned frequently and moved uneasily in his chair. When Mr. Jewett sat down, another gentleman, a pompous bank director from the next town, arose and spoke for some time in favor of the reduction. While he was willing to admit that the working man had some rights, he thought capital had more. He wandered frequently from the subject and was not called to order by the president. He was followed by others who spoke for and against the object before the meeting, but it was apparent to Mr. Jewett that the majority sided with the president. Finally, Ogden Wells, the manager, got on his feet, and the little odds and ends of conversation which had been going on about the room were suddenly hushed, and the stockholders prepared to give undivided attention to his words. "Gentlemen, while I do not wish you to understand that I oppose the proposed reduction in wages, I do not recommend it. I am running the mill at the present time with the smallest number of employees possible to keep up with the orders in hand, and the total amount of the payroll has been reduced a considerable amount, while at the same time the hands are now watched closer and obliged to work harder. As you will understand, this has caused a good deal of discontent of late. Therefore, I consider it my duty to say that if this cut was decided upon, and I am required to enforce it, it will arouse a very determined opposition on the part of our employees. I'm afraid it will bring about serious trouble. It may even lead to a general strike, for I know that our workers are well organized. I hope, gentlemen, that you will think this matter over seriously before you vote for the reduction." The manager's speech proved something of a sensation among the stockholders. While no one doubted that a reduction of wages in the mill would cause much opposition from the employees, the possibility of a strike on the part of the hands had not occurred to the minds of the prosperous gentlemen whose capital was invested in the Bayport Woolen Mills. This new phase in the situation stiffened the backs of the minority who were opposed to the cut and caused one or two of the other side to waver. The pompous bank director from the adjacent town, however, rose to the occasion. He was thoroughly in sympathy with Duncan Pritchard. In fact, the plan had been cooked up between the two. There was nothing in common between him and labor, organized or unorganized. He looked on the working men and women as mere cattle, and did not hesitate to express himself to that effect. "Gentlemen," he said, holding up his coat tails with one hand while he punctuated his speech with the other, "are we running this mill, or are the hands running it? That's what I want to know. Do you propose to be dictated to by the working people? I should hope not. We have put our good money in this business, and I think, gentlemen, we have the right to carry on our business as we see fit. It's a pretty howdy-do if we have got to defer to the wishes of those we employ. Somebody has got to suffer for this depression. It remains with us to say who it shall be. The mill hands, to whom, as I understand, we have been very liberal, or ourselves. Our manager openly hints that these people will strike if the cut is carried into effect. Well, gentlemen, suppose they do strike. Their places will be filled. There are hundreds, yes, thousands of men and women waiting for positions throughout this state who will be glad to come here at our beck. For my part, gentlemen, I would rather every loom in the mill stood idle for months than we should be compelled to bow to the demands of the people who would have the effrontery to tell us what we shall and what we shall not do. Mr. President, I call for the question." He sat down with the air of a man whose words could not be disputed. Duncan Pritchard immediately put the question of a reduction in the wages to a vote. It was carried by a majority of 2, and the President then adjourned the meeting. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The Reduction of Wages. Next day, printed notices were posted up in different places throughout the big mill, notifying the hands that a 15% reduction in the wages of all employees would go into effect with the beginning of the first week of the next month. Notwithstanding that the mill people had heard that a cut of some kind was under consideration by the stockholders of the company, it was not generally believed that it would be adopted. Therefore the announcement came as an unpleasant surprise and shock to the hands. Ogden Wells, the manager, when he passed through the various departments of the mill that afternoon, could not fail to notice that there was a change in the usual demeanor of the hands. The men looked sullen and determined, the girls silent and uncomfortable. It was as if a storm was brewing in the air. Bits of paper were passed around from hand to hand. In this way every employee in the building was notified that an indignation meeting would be held that night in Washington Hall, which was the place where the regular monthly gatherings of the Bayport Woolen Mills Protective Association were convened. At 8 o'clock the little hall was uncomfortably crowded. It looked as if every girl and every man and boy employed in the Bayport mill was present. They gathered in groups and discussed the momentous question of the cut in wages. Most of the girls looked anxious, a few really distressed, while the men showed in their faces a stern resolve that they meant to resist the reduction to the end. In one corner, not far from the door, Bob Chambers, Andy Ball, and Jake Switzer were standing together. "Well," said the German boy, "what you thinks anyway about it?" "I think it's a blamed shame," spoke up Andy. Bob nodded his head without speaking, thereby indicating that that was his opinion too. "Do we put up with it, as though we've so many sheeps, don't we?" "I should say net," ejaculated Andy vigorously. "Ain't that right, Bob?" "That's right. It ain't a square deal. Every person here is going to protest against it." "What good will that done?" asked Jake. "I bet me your life that the manager will pay attention to nothings we have to spoke upon the subjects." "If he doesn't," said Andy ominously, "there'll be something doing, bet your socks." "Something doing? Well, I bet you, those stockholders, what they took us for, anyways? They thinks they can stood by our necks on just what they feels like." "It'll be a very serious thing for most of us if a strike is decided on," said Bob earnestly. "It means a loss of our wages for an indefinite time. It means that many of the hands and their families will suffer actual want before the matter is settled, if it ever is, in our favor." "Yeah, that ain't no lie, I bet you," acquiesced Jake. "You don't mean you'd throw up the sponge without making a fight for your rights, do you?" asked Andy, looking hard at Bob. "Certainly not," replied the boy with a resolute expression on his face. "I'm ready to go out with the rest if the majority say so, but I hope it may not come to that. I hope Mr. Wells will look at the issue in the way we shall present it to him, for there's no doubt that the committee will be selected to wait upon him to protest against the injustice of the cut, and that he will represent the matter in such a way to Mr. Pritchard that the reduction will be rescinded." "You think so? Well, I don't took much stock in that chances. I bet you $9 their order stoods, and that we will have to put up with it or walk by the mills out." At this point the president of the Protective Association appeared on the platform and rapped for order. The hum of conversation throughout the hall ceased at once, and all eyes were turned in his direction. He stated the object for which the meeting had been called, which of course everybody knew beforehand, and invited the members of the association to express their sentiments on the subject. The first speaker was one of the foremen, and he didn't hesitate to say just what he thought about the announced cut. It wasn't at all complimentary to the stockholders of the company in general, and the manager in particular. He said he hoped all hands would resist it to the bitter end. Then others spoke, and all were for striking at once if the reduction in wages was enforced. Many of the girls, plucking up courage, had something to say on the subject too, so that the feeling throughout the room seemed to be unanimous. The most outspoken of all the men was Jim Flanders, a big husky fellow who worked in the packing room. His language and attitude were decidedly aggressive and even violent. He denounced Duncan Pritchard and Manager Wells in round terms, and hinted that means ought to be taken to bring them to their senses. He was seconded by Luke Sparrow, another packer, who was a crony of his. Their remarks were frowned upon, however, by the chairman of the meetings, who said nothing was ever gained, while much ground was lost, by injudicious action on the part of aggrieved working men. He said he hoped, if the worst came to the worst, and the strike went into effect, that no violence would be indulged in by any of the workers. They were entitled to and would receive the sympathy of the townspeople in their efforts to maintain their rights in a square and orderly way. But if any questionable measures were resorted to, they would surely forfeit the goodwill of the community and be placed at disadvantage. He then appointed a committee to wait upon Mr. Wells. They were instructed to request, in a polite but determined way, that the cut in wages be reconsidered on the grounds that it was manifestly unfair, and could not but entail a great deal of hardship upon the majority of the workers, most of whom had been for many years in the company's employ, and were therefore entitled to a fair deal. The meeting was then dismissed. On the following morning, while Ogden Wells was dictating several letters to his stenographer, one of the office clerks announced that 3 of the men employees wished to see him. Surprised and annoyed, he said, "What do they want?" "They didn't say, sir," replied the clerk. "I'll see them presently," he answered, and went on with his dictation. In a quarter of an hour he had finished, and sent word to the outer office for the men to walk in. He easily guessed what the object was of their call. In fact, he expected something of this kind. He knew that the announcement of the cut in wages would breed trouble, and he was prepared to meet the issue. The committee, chosen the previous evening to wait upon him, entered and lined up in front of his desk. "Well," he said in his short, snappy way, "what can I do for you?" The spokesman of the visitors cleared his throat and said, "We are a committee from the hands of this mill, whom we have been chosen to represent." "What is your grievance? For I presume you have one." "We have come to see you about this reduction in our wages, the notice of which has been placarded up all over the mill." "Well, we would ask that our wages be maintained at the present standard, as we are working now at the lowest possible rates on which we can live. It is—" "The question has been decided by the stockholders," interrupted Manager Wells impatiently. "I have been instructed to make the reduction as announced." "But, sir, we think the matter ought to be reconsidered," protested the spokesman of the committee. "We're not being fairly treated." "I have nothing whatever to do with that, my man," replied the manager brusquely. "I cannot do otherwise than as directed." "Do you mean to say that the cut will be enforced?" "Undoubtedly." The committee was taken all aback by the firm attitude of the manager. The spokesman started to say something more, but Mr. Wells cut him short. "I think you have said all that is necessary," he remarked. "I am very busy this morning, therefore—" "Good morning, sir," replied the chairman of the committee with a cloudy brow. "Good morning," answered the manager curtly. Then the 3 men filed out of the private office, with hope crushed out of their hearts, and sought the president of their association to report the failure of their mission. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Bob and Ruby. The news of the committee had been turned down in a rather brusque manner by Manager Wells was known to every hand in the mill during the dinner hour. It raised a subdued feeling of indignation among the girls, and a muted protest from the men. Everybody had something to say to his or her neighbor about the matter, and the manager's ears ought to have tingled the way all hands talked about him. The committee asserted that he had handled them without gloves, cutting short the spokesman's effort to set the matter squarely before him. For this reason, Manager Wells, who had heretofore been looked upon as a fair man, was abused right and left. Down in the packing room, Jim Flanders addressed his associates in a strongly anarchistic style. "Strike! Why, of course we'll strike!" he cried with an oath. "And if I could have my way, I'd do worse than that, yeah? The durned mill ought to be set afire," growled Luke Sparrow, wagging his head in a significant manner. "That would be carrying things too far," remarked one of the other packers, who didn't believe in extreme methods. "I suppose you wouldn't mind working at lower wages, eh?" exclaimed Flanders with a threatening look at the pacifically disposed packer. "Not on your life, Jim Flanders," replied the man resolutely. "But I don't go in for doing up other people's property." "Ah, you make me sick, Frank Dugan. It's measly-mouthed fellows like you that stand in better men's way. These bloated capitalists will trample all over us and rub it in unless we show 'em we don't stand for it." "That's what they will," chimed in Sparrow. "They ain't got no more heart than this box," and he thumped the wood with one of his hairy fists. "Are we worms or slaves?" roared Flanders. "What I say is this, that the life of a man ain't worth living if he's got to feel that a manager can take the bread out of his mouth and leave his wife and young'uns without bite or sup just when he pleases. A man's a man, I say, and ought to be treated as such." "That's all right," said Dungan. "We're entitled to our rights, and we're going to get them, I hope. But there's a right way and a wrong way about trying to get them." "Bah!" snarled Flanders. "There ain't but one way to get anything out of these money sharks, and that's to frighten 'em. If the mill was to burn down, it'd take a heap of money to build it up again, and stock it with new machinery. That'd make 'em stockholders sick." "You can bet it would," said Sparrow with a grin. "You forget. The mill and its contents are heavily insured, and if it was to burn down, it wouldn't hit the stockholders as hard as you think," said Dungan. Flanders and his side partner hadn't thought of that, and it took the wind out of their sails for the moment. Before anything more could be said on the subject, the 1 o'clock whistle sounded, and work was resumed. The principal topic of conversation in town now became the wage issue at the woolen mill. By far the larger part of the population began to side either openly or secretly, as their interests dictated, with the hands. Duncan Pritchard and Ogden Wells suddenly became unpopular, though of course no one openly showed this sentiment to the two gentlemen themselves. Dexter Pritchard, however, was received with a certain degree of coolness, but he wasn't bright enough to notice the difference. While it was generally believed the mill hands would go out on strike, nothing yet had been definitely arranged by the new committee that had the matter in hand. On the following Monday evening, Bob Chambers called for Ruby Norton at her home, one of the humblest in Bayport, and took her, as usual, to night school. The school is dismissed at 9 o'clock, and, as was their custom, they started off on a roundabout way back in order to make the walk last as long as possible. They walked slowly, and the chief topic of their conversation was the probable strike. "I'm afraid it'll go hard with you, Ruby, to be out of work, especially at this time when your father is ill in bed." "Yes, Bob," she answered, the big tears coming into her pretty eyes. "It's too bad, but I'm afraid it can't be helped. The hands are determined not to work for less money than we're getting now, and it only remains for the committee to say what course will be adopted after the first of the month." "And that is only 1 week away." "That's all." "I think the rich men who own the mill ought to be ashamed of themselves for reducing our wages a second time, and all within a year, too," said Ruby indignantly. "They don't look at the matter from the same standpoint as we do. I have heard that the market is overstocked just now with the line of goods we turn out. This would naturally affect the price. When the profits begin to shrink, the worker is usually the first to suffer." "Well, it isn't fair." "No, it isn't. The owners of this mill can much better afford to stand a temporary loss than the hands, who have no surplus as a rule to fall back on." "It is bad enough to work for a quarter less wages than we had 6 months ago, but think what it'll be when we are out of work altogether. Oh, Bob, what will some of us do?" "I hate to think, Ruby. It isn't so bad for me, because Mother owns the cottage and Hattie makes quite a lot teaching music. In any case, if we do go out at the mill, I don't mean to hang around town with my hands in my pockets." "Why, what will you do? Tackle something else till the trouble is over? But you've never worked anywhere but in the mill, Bob," she cried. "I know that, Ruby, but you don't suppose that fact would keep me from working another job? This is such a small town that it won't be easy for you to find an opening. Then I'll go to Millbrook or Marshfield. They're not so far away." "Oh, Bob, I don't want you to go away," cried Ruby impulsively. "Don't you, little girl?" he said with a thrill of pleasure. "Do you really want me to stay here?" Ruby blushed furiously when she realized what she had said, and didn't answer at once. "Mother and Sis wouldn't want me to go either, I know," he continued, "but I suppose I could get around them somehow." "But you won't go, will you?" asked Ruby, looking very hard at the ground. "Well, I'm not stuck on going. I've never been away from home in my life, and I guess I'd feel pretty homesick if I were to light out. I know everybody here, while in Millbrook or Marshfield I'd feel like a cat in a strange garret." "I'm sure you would," she said softly. "However, one has to dig out sometime, I suppose, and I believe in taking the bull by the horns at the start. But it is rather early yet to talk about leaving Bayport. I think we'll change the subject." So they talked about other things until they reached the Norton cottage. They stood at the gate for another 20 minutes, and then Bob started for home. A smart flurry of rain came on before he was more than halfway home, and Bob took refuge in an old disused shed. Hardly had he done so before the sound of men's voices fell upon his ear, voices deep and angry, speaking words which riveted his attention, for he heard the name of Ogden Wells uttered threateningly and coupled with violent curses. Whoever the men might be, Bob had no wish to run against them. He heard them coming on, talking angrily. More than once they seemed to stop in the path and stand together, speaking in lower tones. He could only distinguish a word now and then, and generally that was an oath. Bob peered out through the heavy shower, which they didn't seem to mind no more than if they were a pair of ducks. Suddenly they turned out of the path and made for the shed. As soon as the boy saw that, he drew back into the gloom of the interior, and feeling an old barrel near one corner, he crouched down behind it. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A Diabolical Scheme. Almost immediately the two men entered the shed. Their voices now sounded familiar to Bob, and coupled with a brief and somewhat indistinct view he caught of them through the darkness and the rain outside, he thought he recognized them as Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow, the most rabid partisans of the strike movement. A moment later all doubts as to their identity were swept away when one of them struck a match to light his pipe, and the bright glow of the match illuminated both of their faces. They were not pleasant faces to look at either, for they were distorted by a sullen anger at the moment. "You're sure you've been very careful, Jim, about addressing that box?" "Don't you fret, Luke. Leave such things to me," Flanders answered with a hoarse chuckle. "Nobody'll ever guess who sent it." "How did you do it?" "I found an old envelope addressed to Wells in the yard. I cut out the name and address and pasted it on the box." "Jim, you got a great head," said Sparrow admiringly. "I'm no fool, at any rate." "There's no danger the thing will blow up in the mail bag?" "No, it's safe enough. We've got it so fixed that it can't explode until the cover is pulled off. Wells will do that himself after he removes the wrapper." "And then?" "It'll be all day with him," replied Flanders grimly. "Curse him. I'd like to be in the office when it goes off." "So would I. He can't be laid out too quick for me. Where did you mail it?" "I didn't mail it, you fool. I met a farmer on the road to Millbrook and gave him the box and $1, and told him to post it and keep the change for his trouble." "Jim, you're about as smart as they come." I'm smart enough not to put my head in a noose." "When do you suppose that package will arrive at the mill?" "It'll come by early morning mail." "I guess we'll hear the explosion, eh?" "We'll hear it, and no one'll be the wiser where the box came from." "That's what I'd like to know, for it would go kind of hard with us if we happened to get catched at such a game." "We're not going to get catched, Luke Sparrow. Nobody knows nothing about this infernal machine but you and me. You put it together, and I wrapped it up so it looks like an ordinary package. We've both had a hand in it, so neither of us can give the other away without putting his own hoof in it," grinned Flanders, but the grin was lost in the dark. "If this blow-up don't settle the wage question, we'll fix another and send it to Duncan Pritchard," said Sparrow. "That's what we will. We'll scare the duff out of them stockholders one way or another." The men continued to smoke away, peer out into the rain, and vent their spite in coarse language against Ogden Wells, Duncan Pritchard, and the whole bunch of the stockholders of the Bayport Woolen Mills. Bob, from his post of concealment behind the barrel, had heard every word they said after entering the shed. Gradually he began to understand the meaning of their conversation. Their murderous object became clear to him, and it made his blood run cold. They had manufactured some kind of an infernal machine, which Flanders had sent by mail to the manager of the mill. It was due to reach Mr. Wells in the morning. The manager was accustomed to receive all kinds of small packages, and of course he would open it at his desk when he went through his mail. Apparently it was constructed as to explode when the cover was pulled off. Bob had read about similar machines, some of which had brought about appalling results to the victim, while others had been detected in time to render them harmless. It was a brutal and cowardly means of working vengeance upon a marked man. "It is right in line with the natures of such fellows as Flanders and Sparrow to get up such a villainous scheme," breathed Bob with a thrill of indignation. "It's lucky the rain drove those chaps in here. I'll put a spoke in their wheel and save Mr. Wells from falling a victim to their design." At that moment Bob's foot slipped and made a slight noise on the floor of the shed. "Hist!" said Flanders. "I heard something move." "So did I," answered Sparrow in an uneasy tone. They listened intently, while Bob, whose heart jumped into his throat at the thought that his presence there might be discovered, kept very quiet. A silence like that in a grave vault followed. "I guess it was a rat," said Flanders at length. "Or maybe the rain," muttered Sparrow, drawing a breath of relief. "Well, I'm going to make sure we're alone," went on Flanders. He struck a match and looked carefully around the interior of the shed. Bob was well out of sight, so neither of the rascals detected him. Flanders, however, saw the empty barrel, and his suspicious nature induced him to walk over and look into it. While he was in the act, the dying match burned his fingers and he dropped it. He struck another match and peered into the barrel. "There ain't nothing," but just then the flare of the match, as he raised his hand, lit up the top of Bob's hat. With a terrible curse, Flanders reached down behind the barrel and grasped the object his sharp eyes saw there. Bob realized a crisis had come, and he tried to elude the scoundrel's clutch. He was not successful, and a moment later Flanders drew him out from his place of concealment. "Strike a match, Sparrow!" roared Bob's captor. "I want to see who I've got here. It's a boy, at any rate." A match flared up, and the two men looked at their captive. "Bob Chambers!" both exclaimed in a breath. It was an unpleasant surprise to them that a mill hand had, in all probability, overheard their conversation. Not only that, but Bob bore the reputation of being an honest, upright lad, who had no bad habits, attending meeting regularly on Sunday, and was well liked by everyone, the few turbulent characters alone excepted, from the manager down. He was the last person in town Flanders and Sparrow would have wanted to get an inkling of their dastardly plot. "What are you doing in here at this time of the night?" demanded the chief ruffian, holding the boy firmly by the collar of his jacket. "I came to get in out of the rain." "You were here when we came, then?" "Yes." "Why were you hiding behind the barrel?" Bob made no reply to this question. "You going to answer me?" "I don't know that it's any of your business," said Bob defiantly. "It is our business," snarled Flanders, giving him a rough shake. What difference could it make to you if I was resting myself until the weather cleared up?" It was an ingenious excuse, but it didn't satisfy the suspicions of the men. "It makes a heap of difference," gritted Flanders. "If you don't want me here, I'll go," replied Bob. "It's stopped raining." "I dare say you'd like to go, but you're not going any the more for that," said the bully villain in a somewhat brutal laugh. "Anyway, not yet. We didn't expect the pleasure of your company, you know," with some sarcasm. "But now that you're here, you've got to stop until we say you can go." The boy's answer to this was a sudden jerk squirming out of Flanders' grasp, and a rush to the door of the shed. Sparrow, however, reached for and caught him in the dark, so the effort to free himself was a failure on Bob's part. "You're mighty spry, my lad, but not quite spry enough," chuckled Flanders, once more securing a grip on the boy. "What do you want with me, anyway?" demanded Bob, a bit uneasily, though he had a pretty clear idea what was in the wind. "We want to know if you've been listening to what we was talking about since we came in here." Bob might easily have denied that he had overheard a word, and no doubt most boys would have done so under the circumstances. But our hero scorned to tell a direct lie, and the only thing he could do was to take refuge in silence. "Did you hear what we said after we came in here?" repeated Flanders in a threatening tone. "I heard a great deal," admitted the boy desperately. "About that box, eh?" hissed the rascal. "Yes." "Did you hear that, Sparrow?" "I hear," snarled his companion in shaky tones. "Look here," snarled Flanders in a voice of suppressed fury. "Why didn't you go when you found we were talking about matters that didn't concern you?" Not knowing what reply to make of this, Bob said nothing. "Why didn't you go?" "I didn't care to have you know I was here," answered Bob doggedly. "You didn't, eh? If we hadn't catched you a-listening behind that barrel, you'd have waited till we went off, and then you'd gone and blowed the whole thing. Ain't that what you meant to do?" Bob didn't answer. "You cantankerous imp!" cried Flanders passionately. "If you don't open your jaw, I'll choke the truth out of you." And the fellow gripped Bob by the throat. "Tell me now what you meant to do if we had not caught you before we left the shed." "I meant to try and stop you from carrying out your plan to kill Mr. Wells with that infernal machine you've mailed to him," said the boy boldly. "You meant to do that, eh?" asked the villain, and his voice was harder and his manner harsher than before. "Yes, I did. I meant to try and save you from the commission of a crime," said Bob, speaking confidently and bravely. "Oh," answered Flanders with a sneer, "that's very good of you. You canting little hypocrite. Having accidentally overheard us, you wanted to turn the information to our moral good. I suppose you didn't figure it would send us to jail, did you?" Bob was silent. "Supposing we let you go, what'll you do?" "What will I do?" "Yes." "I shall try to save Mr. Wells." "You will?" "I will." "You'll tell all you know and have us two jugged." "No, I'm willing to give you a chance," said Bob eagerly. "How?" "I'll warn him against the package, but won't say anything about you or Luke Sparrow." "You're very kind," replied Flanders in jeering tones. "And you think we're green enough to trust you, eh? At any rate, you mean to block our scheme if you get the chance. What shall we do to him, Sparrow?" "I don't know," replied the other rascal in some trepidation. "Well, I know. He's got to be silenced. Do you understand?" "How are you going to do it?" "How?" And Flanders uttered an unpleasant laugh. "I'm not going to state prison to save a little psalm-singing monkey like this chap from a squeeze in the throat or a knock on the head." "You don't mean to murder him?" gasped Sparrow in a tone of protest. "What would you do? Let him go so he could blab on us?" sneered the other. "No, we can't let him go. We could take him somewhere and keep him out of sight." "Where would you say we take him?" snarled his companion. Sparrow scratched his head in a perplexed way and was silent. "You're mighty ready with your suggestions, Luke Sparrow. But what do they amount to? Supposing we did hide him away somewhere, we'd have to feed him and keep him alive, wouldn't we? If we forgot to do it, or something prevented us from doing it, he'd die, wouldn't he? It'll save a lot of trouble and thinking if he is made to slip his wind first instead of last." "I don't like the idea of—" began Sparrow slowly. "Well, you've got to like it. You're in this thing with me, sink or swim. And you're going to do your share, or by Christopher, I'll make you wish you'd never been born," cried Flanders furiously. "What do you want me to do?" asked Sparrow, evidently cowed. "I want you to help me carry this chap to the cot." "To the cot? What for?" asked Luke in surprise. "You'll see when we get there. Just wait a moment till I fasten something around his jaw," and proceeded to gag Bob with a dirty handkerchief. "That'll do. Now, grab his legs and follow me." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. In the Railroad Cut. The cut to which Jim Flanders referred was a railroad cut about a half a mile from the shed, just outside the town limits. 4 tracks of the Eastern Railroad spanned the narrow break in a long, low hill, northward to Millbrook and southward to Marshfield, the nearest stopping places either side of Bayport. The cut was a lonesome spot at all hours, but particularly so at night. Just why Flanders proposed to carry Bob Chambers to that locality was not exactly clear to the somewhat dull comprehension of Luke Sparrow, but he was afraid to inquire into the matter in his companion's present frame of mind. So the 2 men trudged along in silence, bearing their burden between them. The rain had ceased some time back, and the clouds were breaking away, and the rest of the night promised to be clear. There were a couple of switches near the entrance to the cut and the switchman's shanty. As they approached the place they saw a dull gleam of light shining from the solitary window of the hut, which showed that the night switchman was on duty, as he should be. The red light of one switch and the white light of the other faced them as they tramped slowly along. Finally Flanders, who was leading the way, came to a halt a short distance from the entrance to the cut, and motioned to his companion to drop the boy. They laid Bob down on the damp ground, and Flanders put his foot upon his chest to keep him there. "There'll be a freight train along here soon," said the chief rascal in a low tone. "What of it?" asked his companion in guilt. Flanders gave utterance to a hoarse chuckle, which seemed to come from his boots, and then said, "It'll save us the trouble of knocking this chap on the skull or choking the breath out of him." "How will it?" "Look here, Sparrow, you seem to be thicker than the mud out on the harbor. We've got to get rid of this boy, ain't we? Well, what's an easier way than to lay him on the track down that cut yonder, just before the freight comes along? The engine and long train'll chaw him into little bits, and that'll rid us of him for good and all. No fear, then, of any information about that box getting out of him." Bob, where he lay on the ground, heard every word of this horrible suggestion, and its import sent a cold chill to his heart. "Ain't there no other way?" asked Sparrow, who didn't seem to have any heart in the cold-blooded disposal of the boy, although he did not feel the least remorse about sending Manager Wells of the mill to his death in an equally terrible way. "No, there ain't," snarled Flanders impatiently. "He's got to die, and that's all there is to it. It's his own fault for butting in where he wasn't wanted." "I ain't got nothing agin the boy, except he knows too much," said Sparrow. "Ain't that enough?" "It'll be a hanging matter if it's traced to us." "How will it be traced to us? No one has seen us fetching him along so far, and there's no one around here to see us carry him up the track except for the switchman, and he's toasting his toes by the stove in his shanty." "Oh, I hate to do it," answered Luke reluctantly. "Do you know what it would mean to let him go, so he could give the snap agin Wells away? It would mean a 20-year spell for you and me in the state prison. How does that strike you, eh?" said Flanders grimly. 20 years is a long time," answered Luke waveringly. "You can bet it is. I knowed a man once who'd been through that mill, and he said it's worse than being hanged." "But the boy promised not to give us away." "You believe that, do you?" sneered Flanders. "He'll agree to that to save his life. I know I would if I was in his shoes. I don't mean to take no such chance. I wouldn't trust no boy living. He's got to turn up his toes, I tell you. And there ain't the least use of you arguing again, Luke Sparrow. There's the whistle of the freight now. It goes up on this here track. We've got to sneak into the cut before the switchman pokes his nose outside, which he'll do in about 3 shakes of a lamb's tail. That whistle may be a signal for him for all we know otherwise." Flanders reached down and grabbed Bob by the shoulders, while Sparrow got a hold of him once more by the legs, and in that shape they filed into the cut, and were immediately lost in the gloom of the pass. As they walked forward, the heavy panting of the freight engine in their rear reached their ears, as at reduced speed it came rumbling along through the suburbs of Bayport, where the yard rule had to be observed by the engineers. About halfway through the cut there was a break in the hillside, where some rude wooden stairs had been set up for the accommodation of the railroad men who lived on the hill beyond. There was a sign at the top of the steps marked "Danger," which warned the casual pedestrian against using the stairs. This was the spot selected by Flanders, who was well acquainted with the locality, for carrying out this fearful purpose. "Drop him," he said to Sparrow. Luke let go of Bob's legs, but Flanders held the boy upright. "I suppose you understand what you're up against, you tarnacious young monkey," said the rascal, addressing the boy he gripped tightly by the arms to prevent him from getting away. "You've got just about 2 minutes to live, and then you'll be under the wheels of that there freight you can hear coming this way. As I ain't spiteful enough to make you suffer any more than necessary to put a stop to that tongue of yours, I'm going to fix you so you won't ever know you've been chawed up by that train." Bob had been thinking very hard for the moment he realized the fate in store for him. He was now in a state of utter desperation, and though he appeared to be passive, he was mustering his strength for that one final attempt to save himself. He felt the crucial moment had now arrived. Putting every ounce of his energy into effort, he tore himself free, struck Flanders a staggering blow in the face, and turned to flee. The attempt would probably have been successful, for Flanders had been wholly taken by surprise, and the blow, no light one, had momentarily dazed him, while Luke Sparrow was not in a position to hinder the boy's escape, but for the unfortunate fact that Bob's ankle turned under him and he fell between the tracks. He staggered to his feet and fell again. Before he could rise a second time, Flanders jumped on him like a tiger. A desperate struggle ensued, in the midst of which came the prolonged whistle of the freight as it approached the entrance to the cut. Chug, 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 came the panting engine, as if complaining about the heavy, rumbling load it was pulling over the rails. "Blast you!" cried Flanders as the glare of the headlight began to glisten along the rails. He struck fiercely at Bob, and the blow, though only a glancing one on the head, dazed the boy, and he fell back nerveless at the man's mercy. Believing he had thoroughly stunned Bob, which was his original intention, Flanders threw him half across the rail in such a position that the train would cut the lad in two. Then he sprang away, seized the conscience-stricken Sparrow by the arm, and dragged him toward the wooden stairs. "Quick, up with you!" he cried fiercely, "or we shall be seen." Luke allowed himself to be hustled up the steps, and the two villains reached the top of the hill as the freight, with gradually increasing speed, came rolling along through the cut. They paused a dozen yards away. Although they could no longer see the train, they could tell by the sound that it was passing the spot where Bob Chambers lay stretched across the track. "That settles his goose," breathed Flanders. "Nothing now stands between us and Ogden Wells." But Luke Sparrow didn't hear a word his companion said. He was staring through the darkness toward the cut, his eyes distended with horror, and his limbs shaking with a palsy of fear. Already he felt the brand of Cain upon his brow. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, A Close Call. At that moment there came to the ears of the two scoundrels a sound of approaching voices from in front. Two boys, who for some reason or other were out late, for it was now close on to midnight, were coming toward the cut. One of them at least appeared to be unusually happy, for he was singing after a hilarious fashion a popular air. "I'm der kid that's all der candy. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy, I'm a glad I am. So's Uncle Sam. I'm a real live Yankee Doodle, made my name on fame and bottle, just like Mr. Doodle did, riding by their party on. Oh, come off, Jake, interrupted the voice of Andy Bell. You can't sing worth a sour potato. By Shiminy Christmas, the matter with you is that some ears for music you don't got, I bet you. Oh, you call that yop you were getting off singing? Yeah, why not? If it isn't the worst ever, I'm a liar, cried Andy in a disgusted tone. Don't excuse me if I say you've been a liar twice times over. Don't call me a liar, you bunch of misery, or there'll be something doing. Is that so? Well, I bet you, if I hit you once, and if you don't fall down, I'll look and see what you first died do. Well, if I hit you once, somebody'll have to take you to the hospital. I think you was talking by your hot through. You do, eh? Yeah. I've a great mind to give you a biff in the solar plexus. I wouldn't do that if I was you. You will see your mistake pretty soon already yet. They were now abreast of Flanders and Sparrow, who shrank away into the gloom. You make me sick, growled Andy. Is that so? If I was you, then I would seen the doctor as soon as now. If you don't look where you're going to need a doctor to sew you together. What are you trying to do, fall into the cut? Switzer had very nearly made a misstep which would have sent him head foremost down into the rails below. Andy reached out and yanked him back just in time. By Jiminy Christmas, that was a close call, I bet you. Well, don't do it again. There's the stairs in front of you. Well, said Jake sagely, some people don't know so much before some things happens as they know afterwards, ain't it? They went down the steps and started across the tracks, when Jake tripped over something yielding in his path. By Shincher, he exclaimed as he picked himself up, I believe I have cracked my jaw. Serves you right, grumbled Andy, who was in a hurry to get home. Why don't you look where you're going, and not tangle your feet up with the track? I bet you don't been no tracks that took from under mine feets. Oh, rats, come on, retorted Andy impatiently. Just waits a little. I have some curiosity to see what them things was. Jake stooped down and took a close look at the obstruction. By George, it's somebody by the tracks upon. If he stays by this places, he'll pretty soon already get killed, I bet you. Here, Andy, help me take him by the danger out. Who is he? Some drunken tramp? Asked Andy, returning to lend assistance. Nein, it was a boy. What's the matter with him? Got a fit? Well, there was something the matter with him. While Jake lifted the unfortunate to a sitting posture, Andy struck a match. Bob Chambers, cried Andy, dropping his match in his astonishment. Shiminy Christmas, what you been doing around here? Gasped Jake. I say, Bob, said Andy, anxiously shaking his friend by the arm. What does this mean? Bob was fast coming to himself, and in another moment he looked at the indistinct forms of his two friends. Is that you, Andy? He asked. Sure. And here's Jake. If he hadn't tumbled over you, we never would have known you were here. What's the trouble, old chap? Bob got to his feet, looked around, and shuddered. I've just had a narrow squeal for my life, he said. How's that? Inquired Andy curiously. Yaw, chipped in Switzer. How'd that come around? I was brought out here to be made into mincemeat by that freight train that just passed. What? Gasped Andy, while a similar ejaculation gurgled down Jake's throat. That's right, asserted Bob with a shiver. If it hadn't been that the villains placed me in the wrong track, I should have been a mangled corpse by this time. Who done that wickedness? Asked Jake. You'll hardly believe me when I tell you. Well, let us hear, if you know, said Andy. 2 of the mill hands, Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow. You don't mean it, gasped Andy, astonished. Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow? Well, I always thought them pretty bad eggs. For why did they done this thing to you? Because they caught me listening to a plot they had hatched against Ogden Wells. So, what were they going to do to him? Blow him to pieces with an infernal machine they've sent to him through the mail. Oh, come off, Bob. You're drawing it pretty strong, ain't you? Said Andy incredulously. You wouldn't think so if you'd heard those 2 chaps going over the whole thing as I did. They were in earnest, all right. and if it wasn't the real goods, they wouldn't have tried to murder me from getting on to them." "Tell us all about it, Bob," said Andy as the three boys walked out of the cut and started up the first street at hand. Bob at once told them the complete story of his night's adventures. "Well, you've had a close call for a fact," commented Andy. "I bet you," chimed in Jake. "Altogether too close to be pleasant," replied Bob. "What are you going to do about it? You'll have Flanders and Sparrow pulled in right away, of course." "I rather guess I will. I shan't do anything till morning. That'll be time enough. It'll be an unexpected surprise for them, as they think that I'm done for, no doubt. How about that box and the mail? I'll see Mr. Wells first thing in the morning and warn him about it. Those fellows will go up for a good spell for their villainy. There isn't any doubt about it. They can easily be convicted on either charge. They'll get from 15 to 20 years, I should think. Serve 'em right. They've been making a lot of trouble for the society one way or the other. Frank Dugan, one of the packers, said they were talking about setting the mill afire to bring the stockholders to reason. What do you think of that?" "I think it'll be a good thing to get them out of the way." The boys parted at the next corner, each going his own way. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. The Infernal Machine. As Bob sometimes stayed out late at the club, nothing was thought of his getting home after midnight on this particular occasion. He got up at his usual hour next morning, ate his breakfast, and started for the mill, where he had to report promptly at 7 o'clock. On his way he stopped at the residence of Ogden Wells, but found the manager had left town the previous afternoon and was not expected back until 11 o'clock that morning. "I haven't time to go to the police now on my own hook," he mused as he walked rapidly along toward the mill. "I'll have to let the matter rest till I see Mr. Wells. He'll be at the office at 11. I'll be on the lookout for him." Bob kept a wary eye out for Flanders and Sparrow, as he didn't want them to see him, but it happened neither of the rascals showed up for work that morning. The fact of the matter was, both had got intoxicated after their return from the railroad cut to the former's lodgings, and were now sleeping off the effects. The early mail arrived at the mill about 8:30. At 9 o'clock Bob managed to get out of the operating room where he was employed, and went downstairs to the general office. He went up to the office boy, whose duty it was to bring the mail from the post office, and asked him if there was a box or package which might contain a box in Mr. Wells's mail. The boy was surprised at the question, but told him there was nothing of the kind among the pile of letters and newspapers he had laid on the manager's desk. "When you go for the next mail, Eddie?" 11 o'clock. Bob returned to his work, keeping a frequent eye on the clock. It wanted a minute of 11 when the foreman called the boy and told him to go down to the engine room, which was a single-story annex to the mill itself, and fetch a certain tool he wanted. Bob hustled to obey this order. As he passed around on the outside of the building, he looked in at the window of the manager's office. Mr. Wells was at his desk. "I haven't any time to lose," breathed Bob, hurrying on to the engine room. The tool he came for was not found at once, and he had to wait about until the engineer got ready to look it up. This caused a delay of more than 15 minutes, and the boy stood around in a fever of impatience until the implement was finally put in his hands. Then he started back as fast as he could go. As he repassed the private office window, he glanced in again. The manager was holding an oblong package in his two hands, apparently looking at the address on it. "Great Scott!" breathed Bob excitedly. "Suppose that should happen to be the box sent by Jim Flanders. I must warn him without a moment's delay." He would have rapped on the window, but he couldn't approach it on account of several cases which stood in the way. So he did the only thing that occurred to him. He rushed for the door of the outer office. Ogden Wells was generally at his desk at 9 o'clock in the morning. This particular day was an exception. He had gone up to Boston on the previous afternoon to make a provisional arrangement with a well-known agency to supply him with hands in the event that the mill employees went on strike on the 1st of the month. Judging from the temper of the old hands, as well as from the information of what had taken place at their last meeting, which was secretly obtained for him, he believed a strike was imminent. He took time by the forelock in order to be prepared for any emergency. The train from Boston reached Bayport at 10:45, and Mr. Wells was at his desk a couple of minutes before 11. He found the mail as usual piled upon his desk. He put the papers aside and read the letters, making notes for replies. Then he called his stenographer and dictated half a dozen brief answers. While thus engaged, Eddie, the office boy, brought in the second mail. This consisted of 3 letters, a paper, and an oblong package, the latter strongly and carefully wrapped and corded. After going through the letters, Mr. Wells took up the package and looked at it. The address itself was written on heavy envelope paper and pasted on the package wrapper, and part of an old postmark appeared at one corner. Underneath the address was written in a heavy hand, diagonally across the face of the package, the word Samples. Mr. Wells turned it over once or twice in his hands and then looked for his shears. They were not where he usually kept them, but after a few moments' delay he discovered them in his letter basket tray on the top of his desk. The manager was about to cut the cords which secured the wrapper when the door of the office was suddenly dashed open and Bob Chambers rushed in. "Stop, for heaven's sake!" he cried earnestly. "That package contains an infernal machine!" The boy's whirlwind entrance and his startling words produced a sensation in the private office. Ogden Wells, the shears poised in one hand, the package in the other, looked at the young intruder in surprise. The head bookkeeper, who had entered the room a few minutes before for some document he required, turned around and eyed Bob with a look of consternation on his face, while the pretty stenographer, who was on the way to the manager's desk with some typewritten letters in her hand, stopped short and gave a little shriek of terror. But Bob didn't stop until he reached Mr. Wells's side, and then, pointing at the unopened package in the manager's hand, said, "Don't open that. It's dangerous, sir. There's some kind of apparatus in it which is arranged to explode and kill you the moment you take off the cover." Ogden Wells was not a coward. He was cool and collected under the most trying circumstances. He looked calmly at the boy's flushed and excited face, and then said, "How do you know? I'll tell you the whole story if you'll let me, sir." "Certainly. Bring up a chair, and I will listen to you." He put down the package as he spoke, and waited for Bob's explanation. "Do not be alarmed, Miss Sutton," he added, turning to his stenographer, whose frightened countenance at that moment attracted his notice. "You may hand me those letters." The girl gave him the sheets she had in her hand, and then returned to her desk, but she was clearly incapable of going on with her work for the present. Bob took his seat by the manager's side and detailed to him what he had overheard in the deserted shed the night before, how Flanders caught him hiding behind the barrel, and what he and his companion Luke Sparrow had afterward done to him for the purpose of closing his mouth forever. "I was discovered on the track by Andy Ball and Jake Switzer, and they are ready to testify to that fact." Ogden Wells heard the boy through without interrupting him. Then he questioned Bob on several points not quite clear to him. Without making any comment on the story, he drew his office telephone, which connected him with various departments of the mill, toward him, and putting the stopper in a certain hole, placed the receiver to his ear. He had placed himself in communication with the packing department. "Are Flanders and Sparrow at work this morning?" he asked in reply to a distant, "Well, sir?" "No, sir. They've never been both away at the same time before." "That is all," replied the manager, who then connected with another department. "Is Switzer on your floor?" "Yes, sir." "Send him to the office, please." A similar message was sent to the shuttle room for Bob. Both of the boys appeared together and were admitted to the private office at once. They corroborated Bob's statement that they had found him in a semi-unconscious condition on one of the tracks of the Eastern Railroad in the cut outside the town limits. Manager Wells dismissed Andy and Jake with a caution not to open their mouths on the subject. Then he telephoned for an officer of the police. One of the Bayport force soon appeared. "I have reason to believe that this package contains some kind of a bomb or infernal machine. As it came through the mail, I don't think there is any danger of it exploding through mere handling in its present shape. But to be on the safe side, I would advise you to carry it carefully. Take it to the station and soak it well. I will follow you presently to consult with the captain about it." The policeman didn't relish the job, but it was in the line of his duty, and he couldn't well refuse to accept the dangerous package. He carried it gingerly out of the building, to the immense relief of the stenographer especially, who hadn't been easy in her mind from the moment Bob entered the room and made his sensational announcement. "Now, Chambers," said Manager Wells, "take off your working rig. I want you to go with me to the police station." He had already thanked and complimented the boy for the part he had played in the affair, and promised to see that he was rewarded. Bob protested that he didn't want any reward, as he believed that he had only done his duty, but the manager assured him that the awful risk he had faced in connection with the matter entitled him to something more substantial than an ordinary vote of thanks, and he would see that he got it. At the police station, Bob told his story over again to the captain of the force, who immediately issued an order for the arrest of Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow, and officers were sent out to find the two rascals. After the package had been soaked for an hour in a pail of water, the wrapper was carefully removed and the contents found to be a wooden box 6 inches long, 2 inches wide, and 1 inch deep. This was placed in the pail and soaked a considerable while longer. The box had a sliding cover, but instead of opening it in the regular way, the cover was pried off. Then the true character of the package was revealed. There were 2 parlor matches set heads downward in the sliding cover of the box, so that when the cover was withdrawn, the heads of the matches would ignite by striking the slips of emery paper on the bottom. Packed in brownish cotton in the box was a small cylinder of cardboard containing gunpowder, plugged at the ends with cotton. In one end of the box were 2 .32 caliber revolver cartridges, with notches filed in the rims of the shells in such a manner as to expose the powder. There were also several slugs of lead, irregular in shape, loose in the box. "Well," remarked Ogden Wells when he was called to examine the contents of the box, "that is a most ingenious bomb. It wouldn't have done a thing to me if it had exploded in my hands." "That's right," replied the police captain. "It would have laid you out for keeps. You owe your life to that boy." And Mr. Wells agreed with him. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Bob is Rewarded. Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow were not arrested according to program. From some unknown friend they had got a warning in the nick of time to save themselves, and while the officers were entering the house where the men had slept off their drunk by the front door, they slipped out by the back way, so that when the policemen went to Flanders' room the birds had flown. The town was searched for them, but they managed to get off. Ogden Wells called on Dexter Pritchard at his home, and told him the story of the Infernal Machine. He suggested that the company ought to reward Bob Chambers for his zeal in preventing a terrible catastrophe. Mr. Pritchard agreed with him, and instructed the treasurer by telephone to draw a check for $1,000 payable to the order of the boy, and send it to him for his signature, as all the company's checks had to be countersigned by its president. That afternoon the check was sent to the manager, who called Bob to his office and handed it to him, together with a neat gold watch and chain from himself, as an expression of his gratitude to the lad for saving his life. "I'm very much obliged to you, Mr. Wells," said Bob, accepting the testimonial. "I shall place great value upon this watch as coming from you. It is very insignificant in comparison with the obligation you have placed me under by your brave and manly conduct. If you will please remember you have always a friend in me henceforth." Of course, Bob couldn't keep the facts from his mother and sister now, for the evening paper had a full account of his adventure, which led to his saving the life of the manager of the Bayport Woolen Mills, from the Infernal Machine which came through the mails, and by nightfall all Bayport was talking about the boy and the affair. "And you never said a word to us this morning about this awful experience you went through last night," said his sister as soon as they came home that evening. "Oh, Robert, how could you keep us ignorant of your peril?" cried his mother, stroking his hair and kissing him fondly, the tears coursing down her cheeks. "For the very best of reasons, Mother. I didn't want to worry you. But it had to come out, you see. However, I'm all right, Haven't even slipped a cog, so what's the use in saying anything more about it?"
"But it's so terrible to think that you might have been killed and mangled in a frightful way, and nobody could have guessed the cause of it all."
"That's true, Mother, but as long as it didn't occur, you have no cause for worry. A miss is as good as a mile."
"You take it very easy, you bad boy,"
cried Hattie, throwing her arms around his neck for the second time and hugging him as if she never meant to quit. "Come now, Hat, it's awfully nice of you to hug me, but you might reserve a little of it for Parker Jewett when the time comes," with a provoking smile.
"Aren't you too mean for anything?"
cried the girl, blushing furiously. "Don't say a word, folks. See what I've got," and Bob exhibited his handsome gold watch and chain and his check for $1,000 from the company. "Don't that make your mouth water, sis?" Mother and daughter were simply delighted, and perhaps they were not proud of the fortunate son and brother. That night Bob was welcomed at the club by a full house. As soon as he appeared in the room, somebody called for 3 cheers for the president, and they were given with a will that raised the dust from the uncarpeted floor and jarred the atmosphere so that the flags and draperies waved to and fro while the din lasted.
"I bet me your life you fussed the whole thing by der town tonight, ain't it?"
said Jake, his full moon countenance expanding in a broad grin. "Oh, come now," remonstrated Bob. "You fellows will give me the swelled head if you don't quit. Any of you boys would have done exactly as I did under the circumstances."
"We would, I don't think. It looks a brave boy with a glass eye to done what you did, I bet you."
"All right, let it go at that." Next day, when Bob appeared at the mill, he was regarded by all hands as a hero. There were smiles and nods and an occasional congratulatory word for him on all sides. The girls certainly looked on him with a new interest, while Ruby Norton was sure there wasn't another boy like him in the world. About the end of the week there was another big meeting of the mill hands, and it was unanimously voted to go on strike if the new wage scale was enforced on the 1st of the month. A new committee was appointed to wait on Manager Wells and present this ultimatum. President Pritchard was in the manager's office when the committee presented themselves. When Mr. Wells assured the mill hands' representatives that the cut would certainly go into effect as announced, the spokesman of the committee said, "Then, sir, I'm instructed to inform you that the hands will strike in a body." "Strike, will you?" exclaimed Duncan Pritchard, who had been an impatient listener during the brief interview, in an angry tone. "We'll fill the places of every one of you." The spokesman smiled grimly, but made no reply. "Perhaps you think we can't?" almost shouted the official head of the woolen mill. "Remember, every man and woman of you who fails to report as usual for duty next Monday morning will consider themselves discharged. Discharged, do you hear? And you won't be taken back either, not one of you. Not if you come a-begging for your jobs." And Duncan Pritchard shook his finger menacingly at the committee. "It is quite out of my power to alter the mandate of the stockholders of this company," concluded Ogden Wells. "They have adopted the new rate, and I am obliged to put it into effect. Of course, if the hands quit work, I shall try to get new ones to fill their places. It seems to me foolish for you people to strike. 9 out of 10 strikes are failures." The manager turned to his desk as a signal that the interview was at an end, and the committee retired. That afternoon's paper contained the statement that the manager of the Bayport Woolen Mills had refused to make any concessions in regard to the new wage schedule, which was to go into operation on Monday, and in consequence the old hands would certainly go out on strike. This announcement created quite a breeze of excitement in the little New England town, and people began to ask one another what course the strikers would take, and whether there would be any disturbance. When the girls filed past the pay window Saturday afternoon and received their envelopes, it was noticed that every one of them carried with her a small bundle of her belongings she was accustomed to keep in the mill. The men also brought away all their personal property. This significant fact was reported to Manager Wells, who accepted it as conclusive evidence that none of the regular employees would report to work on Monday. Before he went home for the day, he sent a telegram to the Boston agency, which had contracted to furnish him with all the help he required. That afternoon it was noticed that Dexter Pritchard, as he paraded up and down Main Street with his little malacca cane, wore a self-satisfied grin on his face. He was pleased to death that there was going to be a strike at the mill, and chiefly because it would put Ruby Norton out of a job. He had failed in his attempt to get her discharged. "I hate her," he muttered to himself. "She puts on too many lugs for a common mill hand. The strike will be a failure anyway, and she won't be able to get back. I guess she'll have to get out of town or starve. If she'd acted decent with me, I'd stand by her now. She's gone on that Bob Chambers. He's another person I'd give something to do up. The people seem to be making a great fuss over him because he found out about the Infernal Machine. They make me sick. Well, I guess he'll be out of a job same as the rest. But I don't suppose he'll care, for he's got $1,000 to fall back on. My governor was a fool to hand him out so much. $100 would have been loads to my way of thinking. If I could only queer him and Ruby Norton, I'd feel better satisfied. Perhaps I can. Who knows?" With this charitable feeling in his heart, he continued his promenade as far as the Bayport billiard parlors, where he turned in, and finding some of his boon companions there, took a hand at a game of pool. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Strike. Long before 7 o'clock on Monday morning, small groups of the strikers began to gather in the immediate vicinity of the mill. At 6:30, when the smoke usually began to pour out of the tall chimney, there wasn't even a wisp of vapor to be seen. The engineer and his assistant had joined the old hands, and there was nothing doing in the engine room. By and by the timekeeper appeared at the gate, and he was greeted by a chorus of derision from the younger fry standing near. Among these were Jake Switzer and Andy Ball. "Well," remarked Jake, "why don't you got busy, yon Thomas? What you was hired for, anyways? To stood out by the openings and look out? Maybe you was looking for the peoples to come, ain't it? Well, if you look long enough, you'll see 'em before Christmas, I don't think." The timekeeper grinned, but made no reply. "I don't hear me those whistles," went on Jake, making a bluff of listening. "It was 7 by the clock just now. What's the matter with the engine room? Maybe their boilers was on the strike, too." "Here comes the manager," piped up Andy. Ogden Wells was walking smartly down the street toward the mill. By this time there were more than 60 of the old employees near the gate. The manager paid no attention to them, but entered the yard after exchanging a word with the timekeeper. At 7:30 he left by the office entrance and started toward the railroad station. The 7:45 train from Boston brought about 50 men and girls from Boston who had been sent to take the places of the strikers. Manager Wells and 2 policemen met them and piloted them to the mill. Their appearance was greeted by a chorus of hoots and groans from the strikers, now augmented to more than 100, who had formed a lane from the gate to the street corner, and through which the newcomers had to pass. The majority of the old hands contented themselves with viewing the strikebreakers with solemn displeasure, making no effort to prevent them from entering the mill yard. Whether they were deterred by the presence of Ogden Wells, whose face wore a resolute look, or the 2 policemen, or because their leaders had instructed them not to make a disturbance, certain it is that they made no demonstration beyond a few hoots and groans here and there. As the last new hand passed inside, Andy yelled out, "3 crowns for Ogden Wells!" The crowd right around him took the cue and groaned lustily, and the sound rolled right along down the 2 lines. At this moment Bob Chambers and Ruby Norton came walking slowly down the street. They did not mingle with the others, but stood on the other side of the way and watched the proceedings with much interest. As the mob broke up into groups again, Jake and Andy saw Bob and Ruby and joined them.
"Did you see them? Those new hands?"
asked Switzer.
"No," replied Bob.
"They don't last, I bet you."
"That's right," chirped Andy. "We won't do a thing to them when we get the chance."
"Better keep out of trouble, Andy,"
advised Bob. "You know what the orders are. No roughhouse or anything of that kind. Are we going to let these newcomers keep our jobs from us?" "Well, I guess not." And Andy looked as if he was just aching for a scrap. "There's a big committee appointed to look after that," said Bob. "We can't win by raising a rumpus." "They've no business coming here when they know there's a strike on," persisted Andy. "What's the use kicking? You always find lots to do that in every trade." "Then they ought to be treated as they deserve, that's what I say." "What you thinks about it, Miss Ruby?" asked Jake. "I think it's a shame that the company cut our wages and made us go out in self-defense," she replied spiritedly. "By shinder, two of 'em ought to got up a processions and walked by the president's house and spoke to him about somethings like that. Maybe some impressions it would make on him, ain't it?" "I'm afraid not," said Bob. "Duncan Pritchard isn't the kind of man that's easily moved from his purpose. I understand he's at the bottom of the reduction. If so, the women and girls would only be wasting their breath on him." "Well, the man that would all the profits took was a hogs, and I'd just as soon set up his face." "Rich your life he is," chimed in Andy. Another chorus of hootings from the workers attracted their attention. This was occasioned by the appearance of a dozen women and girls who had come over from Marshfield in a wagon. The strikers blocked the way of the vehicle, and the occupants began to grow frightened, though no actual violence was intended. They were beset on all sides by requests from the old hands to go back. The driver tried to urge the horses forward, but could make no headway through the crowd. Some threats were uttered, and several sticks were waved in the air by way of intimidation. Then two strikers began to push the animals around. At this point Ogden Wells and one of the officers appeared at the gate and came to the rescue. They were greeted by hoots and catcalls, but that was the extent of the interference. After much trouble, the wagon was driven into the yard. When it came out again empty, the driver was pelted by the many urchins about with sticks and clods of earth. The 9:50 Boston train brought in another lot of girls and a few men from the city, and a larger crowd of strikers being present, half a dozen policemen were called on to escort them to the mill. They were received with many manifestations of anger and hostility by the old hands, but there was no actual collision. "What do you want to come here and take honest folks' work for?" shouted the angry wife of one of the foremen. "Hi, hi, hi!" echoed along the line. "Stand back there!" commanded the two officers in the lead. "Wouldn't those policemen make you sick?" said Jake in a tone of disgust. The crowd now seemed on the point of losing its temper, for it surged about excitedly. "Down with the scabs!" cried a stentorian voice. A great uproar ensued, in the midst of which half a dozen men, in the form of a football flying wedge, pushed through the crowd, scattering strikers and newcomers right and left, and throwing the whole street into a scene of confusion. The air was filled with shrieks, hoots, and derisive laughter. Manager Wells and the officers were mixed up and detached from the new hands, and for a few moments a scene of pandemonium ensued. When the order was finally somewhat restored, more than half of the fresh arrivals had disappeared, and no one seemed to know where they had vanished to. When the strikers realized this, there was a great burst of cheering. It was the first victory. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Dexter Pritchard Gets Ugly. The police now got busy in earnest and drove the crowd of strikers away from the immediate neighborhood of the gate. They were hooted and jeered at and given as much trouble as possible, but no one ventured to resist them openly. The smoke now began to pour out of the big chimney. An engineer and fireman had been secured. Just then a light buggy drove up to the office entrance of the mill. In it were Duncan Pritchard and his son Dexter. They were received with a howl of derision. The elder Pritchard got out and entered the office, and then Dexter turned the horse around and started off up the street. At the moment Ruby was crossing the road to speak to one of her friends. Dexter saw her, and whipping up his spirited animal, deliberately ran her down. At least, that seemed to be his intention.
The three boys, Bob, Andy, and Jake, happened to be looking at him at the time. Andy and Jake threw up their hands and shouted to Ruby to look out. Bob, however, with a cry of anger, rushed for the horse's head. Ruby saw the animal almost upon her, and stood right where she was, paralyzed with fear. Bob reached the spot not a moment too soon and grasped the mare's bridle. "Let that horse alone!" roared Dexter furiously. "What's the matter with you?" cried Bob. "Do you want to run her over?" "Get out of my way, you beggar!" exclaimed the young aristocrat, snapping the whiplash about Bob's ears. The young mill hand caught the lash with one hand and jerked the whip out of Dexter's hand. "Give me my whip, you villain!" sputtered Dexter Pritchard in a rage. "By Shinger, I would give you the whip the way you wouldn't like it if I had, I bet you!" shouted Jake, shaking his fist at the magnate's son. Dexter, mad with anger, lashed his horse with the reins. She reared up and tore herself free from Bob's hold, swerved to one side and dashed forward, just clearing the brave boy by a bare inch. Ruby, with a little cry, fainted dead away in Bob's arms. "By George!" cried Jake. "Did you ever see anything like that?" "He ought to be kicked from here to the bay," said Andy angrily. "Well, if I was Bob Chambers, I know what I would done to him when I seen that shoozer again, I bet you. I would leave their mob off the Yarmany by his face upon." Bob carried Ruby to the sidewalk where several of her girl friends took charge of her. "What the dickens did Dexter Pritchard mean?" asked the boy in some excitement. "He might have killed or injured us both by the way he acted. His father ought to be told of this. I won't stand for anything like that from anybody. One would think he took leave of his senses." "I'm going to have an explanation, or I'll know the reason why," said Bob resolutely. "That's right. But if you was me, I would lick him first, and explanations took after that." "I'll take this whip into the office and see Mr. Pritchard about the matter," said Bob after seeing that Ruby had recovered, started to carry out his intention. But the incident didn't stop there. The affair had attracted the attention of many of the strikers, and they gathered around and wanted to know all about it. Switzer and Andy Ball made no bones about what Dexter had done. In fact, they represented the matter in its worst light. Their story roused the listeners to a fever pitch of indignation, and Ruby's white face added to their anger. One of the agitators in the crowd seized the chance to address the strikers in a revolutionary way, and he didn't have much trouble to arouse bad blood. He handled the Pritchards without gloves, denounced the upper class generally, and did not forget to drag in Ogden Wells for a share of his venom. There is little doubt but an incipient riot would have ensued if it hadn't been for the quick action of several of the leaders present, who, scenting trouble, hastened to address the crowd, begging their fellows to be calm and not allow themselves to be led into any act that they would afterward regret. This sensible course had the desired effect, and the mob cooled down. Another batch of outsiders were brought into the mill during the afternoon, but they were not molested, though the strikers appealed to them not to go to the mill without success. The police maintained the utmost vigilance about the mill property, and kept the disgruntled old hands at a respectable distance. Nearly all the girls and women left the neighborhood early, while the men remained to canvass the situation and patronize the nearest saloon. By 5 o'clock most of the crowd had dwindled away to the regular pickets and the members of the committee who had the strike in charge. They waited patiently about for the mill to shut down and the newcomers to come out, intending then to argue the matter with them. This plan was frustrated by Ogden Wells, who had secured a big building nearby and turned it into a temporary boarding and lodging house. When the new force knocked off, they were mustered in the yard and marched in a body, under police protection, to the building. After they entered, 2 policemen were left to stand guard at the door, and the strike committee, seeing the futility of further interference, withdrew with the pickets until morning. In the meantime, Bob Chambers obtained an interview with Duncan Pritchard, and called his attention to the singular conduct of his son. The magnate was rather annoyed at the incident, but naturally was inclined to gloss over Dexter's behavior. "Young man, I think you're making a mountain out of a molehill," said Mr. Pritchard loftily. "Why should my son try to run over Miss Norton, or in fact anyone else? Why, the idea is ridiculous. The horse is a spirited one, and must have become frightened and somewhat unmanageable by the crowd in the street.
There was no crowd in the street at that point. Ruby was crossing—" "Yes, I know," interrupted the president of the company impatiently. "But it is really preposterous to suppose that Dexter would deliberately try to do either of you an injury." "Then, sir, you discredit my statement," replied the boy indignantly. "I certainly believe you are mistaken in the matter. By the way, I think you are the boy who warned Mr. Wells about the Infernal Machine, are you not?" "I am, sir." "You received $1,000 from the company, did you not?" "I received a check for that amount." "Then let me say, young man, you have shown very poor taste, I repeat, by deserting the company with the rest of the men. Common gratitude should have suggested to you the propriety of sticking by those who so munificently, I believe that is a proper word, rewarded you. That is all, young man. You may go." The manager was present and heard the entire interview. He nodded pleasantly to Bob when the boy was leaving the room, and Bob politely acknowledged his salutation. "It is clear I haven't gained much by appealing to Mr. Duncan Pritchard," said the lad to himself. "I might have guessed that he would have stood up for his son. I'll have to settle this case with Dexter myself." "Well, Boppy," said Jake when Bob rejoined his friends, "what did you done?" "Not much," replied the boy in a dissatisfied tone. "Didn't I told you so, Andy? What would you expect from a big puddock runt?" "Where's Ruby?" asked Bob, looking around. "She went home with 3 of the girls a while ago," answered Andy. "She's all broke up." "Well, it's a shame. Dexter Pritchard shall answer for this." "If you was me, I wouldn't took no nonsense about it. I would stood by his neck and pretty soon already." "That's right," nodded Andy. "He's down on Ruby 'cause she wouldn't cotton to him. You remember what he said to her in front of the mill a couple of weeks ago? He's trying to get square. If Ruby was my girl, I'd break his face for him if I got pulled in for it afterward." "It wouldn't be any more than he deserves," replied Bob as the boys started for their homes. And thus ended the first day of the strike, as far as they were concerned. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, The Scrap on Main Street. By Wednesday, the 3rd day of the strike, the company had managed to secure about 2/3 of the required help to run the mill. That morning, however, the new engineer didn't show up, and the manager had to send to Boston for another, so that the machinery didn't get in motion until after the noon hour. The Bayport Daily News, which published both a morning and afternoon edition, came out flat-footed for the strikers. It printed a good deal of unpleasant reading matter for Duncan Pritchard and the stockholders of the company. As almost every person in town sympathized more or less with the old hands, the owners of the mill experienced a coolness in the social and business atmosphere which they had never noticed before. Some of the stockholders privately expressed regret that they had voted for the reduction. Those who had voted against the cut took care to let the fact become known. Duncan Pritchard, however, believed he could afford to defy public opinion. When interviewed by the reporters, he was aggressive and defiant. He repeated his assertion that the old hands were out of the mill for good. Dexter Pritchard owned a very handsome little sailboat, in which he and some of his friends cruised around the harbor, and sometimes along the coast outside when the weather conditions were satisfactory to him. On Wednesday afternoon, he and 2 cronies left the Bayport billiard parlors and started for the private wharf on the Pritchard property, off which the Spray was anchored. They were going to take a sail. It happened that Bob Chambers, Andy Ball, and Jake Switzer were coming out of their club as Dexter and his associates came along Main Street. Bob, who was something of an amateur sailor in his way, had borrowed a catboat for that afternoon and was going to take Andy and Jake down the bay with him. As soon as Bob caught sight of the son of Duncan Pritchard, he walked up and confronted him with a stern face. "I want an explanation from you, Dexter Pritchard, of your attempt to ride over Ruby Norton on Monday," he demanded. Dexter started back, glared at Bob, and raised his little malacca cane in a threatening way. "How dare you stop me on the street, you interfering puppy?" blustered the magnate's son. Bob's eyes flashed at this insult, but he kept cool. "I want an answer from you, Pritchard, and if it isn't satisfactory, I'll see that Ruby has you arrested. You'll find out why you won't be permitted to endanger people's lives in this town merely to gratify a personal spite you have against them, and the fact that you are the son of the richest man in Bayport won't save you." By this time Dexter's face was white with rage. You pauper! You common mill boy! I've a mind to strike you to the sidewalk," he cried passionately. "You better not try such a thing if you know when you're well off," replied Bob coolly. Dexter's answer was to bring his upraised cane down full on the mill boy's head, but it didn't land as the young aristocrat had intended. Bob had seen his purpose in his eyes, dodged quickly, seized and tore the cane from his grasp, and promptly knocked Dexter down. "It's a fight," grinned Andy to Jake. "I don't think," answered the German boy. "But if it was, the other fellows don't be in for a copper cent." Dexter looked dazed and confounded. He hardly knew what had happened to him, the shock had come so sudden. He sat up and stared stupidly about. "Will I help you up?" asked Jake, making a bluff to offer his assistance, as the dude's companion stood well back and never offered to interfere. "I never expected to see you setting yourself down by the sidewalks to rest, Mr. Pritchard." Dexter kicked out his legs with unexpected suddenness, and gave Switzer such a whack on the shins that the German had lost his balance and sat down too. "Ha ha!" roared Andy. "I hope you didn't make a hole in the sidewalk, Jake." A small crowd began to gather to see the fun. "Thunder and Blitzen! What you people's found to laugh at?" cried Jake in a tone of disgust as he picked himself up. Dexter also scrambled to his feet and shook his fist at Bob. "I'll make you pay for that, you villain!" he cried furiously. "I'll have you arrested for striking me, you scum!" "Why don't you put up your fist like a little man?" jeered Andy, who felt disappointed that the mix-up was so brief. "Why, Shinzer, he can put up his fist like a little donkey, I bet you," growled the German boy. "Give me my cane!" roared Dexter, making a snatch at it. Bob stepped back, deliberately broke it across his knee, and threw the pieces into the street. Dexter, almost wild with rage, rushed at Bob and struck at him with both fists, but the mill boy with a smile easily warded off the blows. Then the magnate's son kicked viciously at him. Bob caught his foot, and he went down like a shot. The crowd laughed and jeered at young Pritchard, whom they recognized. The mill boy had their sympathy. "By George, you done it twice times, mid imbedly, I bet you. The next times you put mine shins against your feet, I will done it too." "Come, let's go," said Bob to his two companions. "This little affair has attracted too much attention to suit me." They pushed their way through the grinning mob, and were crossing the street when Dexter was assisted up by one of his friends. The young dude was in a furious rage over his discomfiture. Not seeing Bob, he glared at the circle of amused spectators, some of whom passed rather uncomplimentary remarks about him. His friends, not relishing the situation, took hold of him and led him away. They had all they could do to pacify him. Finally he cooled down, and the three continued on their way to the Pritchard grounds. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, The Taming of Dexter Pritchard. 2 hours later, a finely modeled sloop yacht, about 18 feet in length, and a trim-built catboat, not quite so long, were nearing a wooded island at the entrance to Bayport Harbor. Both under bellying mainsail were heeled to starboard, and darted ahead before the stiff 6-knot breeze blowing offshore. The wind had steadily increased since the boats left their moorings, and Dexter Pritchard, who was steering the Spray, was beginning to grow nervous. He would have turned back, but he was ashamed to do so, as he had boasted of his ability to handle his yacht under all weather conditions. Besides, she was practically safe, having 4 copper air tanks, so that she would not sink with 6 persons aboard if she were full of water. Dexter, however, was by no means expert in the knack of sailing a boat, and now every time she made a sudden dip, when a sharp flaw struck the mainsail, he turned pale and wished he was on shore. It was different with Bob Chambers in the foam catboat. He had taken lessons from the boatman who owned the little craft, and who was very friendly with him,
and was able to handle the boat almost as well as its owner. He loved the water, and went out on the bay in the foam or in swimming off the point whenever he got a chance. The Spray was the faster boat of the two, but was handicapped under her green owner. Dexter and his friends had got afloat first, yet by the time the mouth of the bay was almost reached, the catboat had overhauled and passed the Spray to the leeward. "Shall we come about or go outside?" asked Bob as they were passing abreast of the island. "It's pretty rough yonder, and it'll give us a good shaking up." "Oh, keep right on," replied Andy. "I don't know about that," objected Jake. "If I'd been much rougher as here, you will excuse me if I said nid." "Oh, if you're afraid, we'll put you ashore on the island and take you up when we come back." "I didn't say I was afraid, but if I'd been all the same, I'd just as soon stood by the beach upon a little whiles myself and rest." "Hello!" cried Bob at this juncture. "Those chaps yonder are in trouble." He pointed to the Spray, which was now floundering about in the trough of the sea sweeping in from the Atlantic, her boom threshing the water way to the leeward. The fact of the matter was a sudden flaw had wrenched the main sheet out of Dexter Pritchard's hand, and the boom in consequence had got away from him. It placed the party in an unpleasant position. With a skillful boatman it would instantly have been remedied by bringing the yacht up into the wind, when the boom would have swung back and the sheet line have been recovered. It was a simple thing to do, but Dexter lost his head and became terrified when he ought to have remained cool. He looked helplessly at the truant boom, and did nothing. The Spray was steered by a horizontal wheel, the tiller moving in the direction opposite to the way the wheel was turned. Finally, Dexter, in his confusion, did the right thing accidentally. He pulled the wheel toward him. He was seated on the weather side of the steering gear. The boat at once answered to her helm, and the boom swung in. Before it came quite within his reach, he stood up and reached for the sheet. Just then another flaw struck the sail, and away it went back again, for Dexter had let go of the wheel. The boat dipped smartly to leeward, and the boy lost his balance and was precipitated overboard. "By George!" cried Bob, who with his companions was watching the Spray intently. "Dexter Pritchard's overboard!" He altered the foam's course at once and bore down on the spot where the young aristocrat had disappeared beneath the rough water off the island. "By shinder, he was a gone goose, I bet you!" exclaimed the German boy in some excitement. "He is if he can't swim a little," said Andy. "I don't see him. Do you, Bobby?" "Yes, there he is, just a fathom or so beyond his hat. I've looked out their boat hooks and pulled them out if he don't go by the bottoms too quick." Before the foam got close enough for the boys to reach Dexter, he disappeared once more. "That's bad!" cried Jake when he saw the water close over Pritchard's head. "Do you think he'd been down for sure, Bobby?" "I hope not," replied Bob anxiously, for he was all eagerness to save the life of his enemy. "He ought to come up again. Keep your eyes skinned for him, fellows. It's his last chance." "There he is!" exclaimed Andy presently. Dexter had come up not 6 feet away. "By shinder, I got him now, I bet you!" cried Switzer, reaching for the drowning boy with the boat hook. But he hadn't. A flaw struck the foam, the boat dipped, and Bob had to luff her up. The German boy, feeling he was losing his balance, dropped the hook into the water, where it sank at once, and grabbed Andy to save himself. Bob saw that it was all up with Dexter unless he took the prompted kind of action. "Take the helm, Andy!" he cried in ringing tones. Peeling off his hat and jacket and kicking off his low-cut shoes, Bob plunged into the water, diving straight at young Pritchard, who, now quite unconscious, was slowly sinking for the last time. He caught the boy a foot under the surface and came to the top with him. As soon as he appeared, Jake flung a rope to him, which he caught. Inside of a minute the two were dragged into the cockpit of the foam. "By Shiminy Cribs! That was a narrow squeak for Mr. Pritchard, I bet you." "We'll have to go ashore," said Bob, "and bring Dexter to his senses." They laid the half-drowned boy face downward in the cockpit, and about half a pint of salt water ran out of his mouth. Bob ran the catboat under the lee of the outermost point on the island and held her close to the beach, while Andy and Jake carried Dexter ashore. Then, after telling them what to do with their charge, he steered out after the Spray, which still rolled about at the mercy of the waves and was drifting out to sea, the boys on board of her not knowing what to do in the emergency. As he approached her stern from the leeward, Bob watched his chance, let the mainsail down by the run, then leapt aboard the Spray with the painter of the foam in his hand. It was a risky move, but the only thing to be done under the circumstances. If he hadn't timed his movements to a nicety, he would probably have landed in the water instead of where he aimed for. With Bob it was then but the work of a moment to recover the stray boom and sheet. After that he sailed the Spray to the island, towing the catboat after her, and secured both craft to the beach by passing their painters around a big stone. Dexter's friends were pretty well frightened by their recent experience and were glad to feel the solid earth under their feet once more. Pritchard was brought around after a time, but he was a pretty fishy-looking object. "Well, how you felt now?" Jake asked him as soon as he was able to sit up. His arrogant manner had completely disappeared, and he was as humble as any boy could be. He seemed to realize that he had escaped death by the skin of his teeth, and that fact made a powerful impression on him. When one of his cronies told him that Bob Chambers, at the risk of his own life, had saved him from a watery grave, he didn't say a word for some time. Finally, he motioned to Bob, who was wringing the water out of his garments, and the mill boy, curious to hear what he had to say, went up to him. "I want to thank you for what you did for me," he said in a low voice, with downcast eyes. "I don't see how you came to do it, as I haven't been a friend of yours, but you shan't regret it. I'll make it all right by you, at least my father will. I'll see that he gives you another $1,000. He can afford it." "Stop!" cried Bob. "You mustn't talk about paying me for what I did for you. I'm not such a cannibal as to see you or anyone else drown if I can help it. I'm glad I managed to save you. I don't expect, nor will I accept, anything but your gratitude if it's in you for my services, which you are welcome to." "I suppose you've a right to be down on me," answered Dexter without looking up. "I'm not down on you. I'm satisfied to let the past go if you say so." "I'm willing to be friends if you are," Pritchard said at last, though the word evidently cost him an effort. "I'm afraid you'll change your mind when you get over the shock," answered Bob doubtfully. "No, I won't. I mean what I say. You've done me a good turn. You've saved my life. You might have let me drown after the way I treated you. You're different from any of the other fellows I know. I'm going to be your friend if you'll let me. I'll see that you get back in the mill, and that Ruby Norton does too, and your friends here also. My father will do anything I want." "Well, if you want to be friendly with me, I'm not going to object. I'm only a mill boy, you know, and not in your social class." "That doesn't make any difference with me as far as you're concerned, Bob Chambers. Will you shake hands with me?" "Certainly," and Bob held out his hand. Dexter got up and took it. "We are friends now from this out," he said with an earnestness strangely at variance with his old-time manners, and Bob wondered how long his regeneration would last. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Bob Meets with a Surprise. It was getting near sundown, and Bob proposed that they ought to return to town. Dexter Pritchard protested that he couldn't think of going back till he had dried his clothes. So all hands gathered a quantity of brush and driftwood and made a bonfire. While their garments were being dried, Bob and Dexter took refuge in the handsome little cabin of the Spray, where the two boys talked together as if they had been old friends instead of recent enemies. "Where's Jake?" asked Bob while he was putting on his dry clothes. "He saw a squirrel on that log yonder and gave chase to it," laughed Andy. "He's the craziest fellow I ever saw." "Hey, Jake!" shouted Bob, fashioning his hands into a speaking trumpet. "We're waiting for you." All the same, Switzer didn't answer, nor did he appear within the next 10 minutes, although all hands yelled to him several times. "Where the dickens can he have got to?" said Bob. "We'll have to hunt him up for it's time to get a move on." Leaving Dexter seated on a rock, the rest of the boys scattered through the brush and wood beyond, yelling "Jake!" every once in a while, but never a sign of the German boy did they see. Bob followed a sort of ravine among the rocks and scrub leading toward the center of the island and got separated more and more from the other three. Suddenly, as he turned the corner of a big rock, he ran smack into the arms of a man. Before he knew what was in the wind, he was thrown down, his arms secured behind and a handkerchief tied tightly over his mouth. Two men had a hold of him, and it didn't take but a glance for him to recognize them. They were Jake Flanders and Luke Sparrow, and they looked the very picture of hard luck. "So we got to hold you again, eh?" said Flanders with a malicious grin. "You put a spoke in our wheel a week ago, and we had to cut town at a lively gait. How you managed to escape the wheels of that freight beats me, but it seems you did. We've been watching you chaps since you landed on the island, and a figuring how we could put our flukes onto you, and now you kindly walks into our parlor as the fly did to the spider. Now we've got you where the hair is short. We'll pay off the score we've again you."
"What are you going to do to him, Jim?" asked Sparrow.
"What should we do to him after he went and spoiled that scheme of ours to do up wells and got us spotted by the police?" said Flanders savagely. Sparrow regarded the boy vindictively, but didn't say anything. "We've catched him just in time, seeing as we're going to cut and run tonight, after we fix that job at the mill. It'll be a satisfaction to know we've got square with the young jigger." Flanders yanked Bob along by the collar as if he were a bale of goods, and thrust him through the bushes into a dark aperture among the rocks, where they left him. In the meantime, the rest of the boys came upon Jake, watching the end of an old decayed log into which the squirrel he was after had disappeared. They soon found there was an opening at the other end through which the cute little animal had got away, and they gave Switzer the laugh. Then they turned to the shore, where they waited for Bob to turn up. It was now beginning to grow dark, and Dexter decided that he couldn't wait on the island any longer, so he and his friends embarked on the Spray and started for town, leaving Andy and the German boy wondering what had become of Bob.
"What you think, Andy? Do we stay here all night?"
asked Jake when the gloom grew deep on the surface of the bay.
"Search me, Jake. We can't go without Bob." "That's right. But where he has taken himself to, that's the questions. Ask me something easier. Maybe he fell down somewheres among the rocks. What you thinks?" asked Jake a bit anxiously.
"I hope not. It's all your fault anyway for chasing that squirrel," growled Andy. "What'd you do such a fool thing for?"
"For why I done it? I have weaknesses for our live squirrel."
Andy snorted and kicked a hole in the sand with his heels. As time passed, the boys grew more anxious and impatient. They kept the fire on the beach up to let the absent Bob know they were waiting for him, as well as to serve as a guide for him.
"I don't see how we can go and hunt him up in the dark," said Andy. "It'll be a nice thing if an accident has happened to him." "Couldn't we take the lanterns with us?" suggested Jake. "There was fun by the poke cabins."
"We ought to do something," said Andy, who was greatly perplexed over the situation. Finally, he decided to get the lantern and go off and search the island with Jake. They piled a lot of fresh fuel on the fire, including a good-sized log, and then started on their quest. They came to the ravine which Bob had entered and stumbled along through the brush and rocks, swinging the lantern to and fro.
"That's been the worstest jobs I ever seen, I bid me your life," said Jake.
At that moment he tripped over a tough creeper running across his path and pitched against the side of the ravine.
"Jiminy cribs! Help!"
Andy stopped and swung the light of the lantern in that direction. Half of the German's body had vanished through the bushes, and he was beating the night air with his heels. His voice came to Andy in a muffled strain, as if he was half smothered in a hole. Andy put the lantern down and dragged him out of his predicament by the heels. Jake's face was scratched and covered with soft dirt.
"Well, you're a sight for sore eyes," growled Andy.
Switzer spat out a mouthful of dirt with a grimace.
"Don't say nothings, but give me the light. There was somebody's alive in that holes, and I don't mean an animal's neither."
"What are you giving me?" replied Andy incredulously.
"You waits a little."
He bent down the bushes, and the lantern rays disclosed a yawning hole among the rocks. Jake thrust the lantern into the aperture and gave a yell.
"Pensioner, if it ain't Bobby in here, you was a liar."
"Get out!" cried Andy in some excitement.
"Well, take a look for yourself. if you don't believe it." And he got down on his hands and knees and looked into the hole. "By jingo, it is for a fact. What's he doing in there with a handkerchief over his mouth and his hands behind him?" Bob heard them outside and kicked vigorously with his legs. "Did you ever see anything like that?" cried the German boy. "He's kicking his feet like fun. Something was the matter with him. Grab his feet and we have him out right away quick." Each caught one of Bob's limbs and pulled. Out he glided into the circle of lantern light. "Why, he's bound and gagged!" exclaimed Andy in amazement. The German boy's eyes stuck out like goggles. Andy yanked the handkerchief off Bob's mouth and then fished in his pocket for his knife. "Thanks, old man," said Bob, drawing a long breath of relief. "How came you to be in this shape, Bob?" asked Andy, as he cut away the cord which held his friend's hands. "Who did this?" "Who did it? Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow. They've been hiding on this island since they escaped from the police," replied Bob, regaining his feet. "You don't said so!" ejaculated Jake. "Hiding on the island, are they?" cried Andy. "Then we'll hurry back to town and send the cops down here after them." "I'm afraid it won't do any good now," replied Bob, shaking his head. "Why not?" "Because I guess they've gone away by this time. They've got a boat somewhere along shore. I heard them say they were going to leave this section tonight. Before they go, they're going to do something to the mill. Set it afire, I dare say, if they can manage it. We must prevent them." "But why did they tie and gag you and stow you into that hole?" "In revenge for my exposure of that infernal machine plot of theirs." "Great Caesar's ghost! You might never have been found till long after you had starved to death. What cold-blooded rascals they are!" "They meant to do me up, all right," said Bob, as the three came in sight of the glowing embers of the bonfire. "And they meant to done you up the nights they put you by the tracks in the cud. Well, it's a fine thing to be born lucky, I bet you. You fall your feet on every time, Bobby." "Why, where's the boat?" asked Bob, looking around the spot where the foam had been moored. Jake and Andy looked too. The cat boat had mysteriously vanished. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of A Rise in Life by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Conclusion. "I believe those chaps have taken our boat," said Bob at last. "Glory hallelujah! What are we going to do then?" gasped Andy in dismay. "Yeah, we were left behind in the soup." "This is tough," remarked Bob, looking at the blank faces of his friends. "I should say it is," grumbled Andy. "Well, I bet you. If Flanders and Sparrows took the catboat, they must have left their own boat somewhere about. They never could have come to this island without one." "Most likely it was a rowboat," said Andy. "That's why they sneaked the foam. No matter what it is, we must hunt it up if we want to get away from this place tonight. I'm anxious to prevent those rascals from doing any injury to the mill. If it burned down, people would say the strikers set it on fire, and it would be bound to hurt us." "It would at that," admitted Andy. "Well, come along. We'll examine the shore and see if we can find a boat of any kind," said Bob, starting forward along the water's edge with a lantern. They walked halfway around the island before their search was rewarded by the discovery of a small flatboat drawn up on the beach of a little cove. One pair of rudely made oars lay under the water which half filled her. "She's a peach of a boat to get back to town in," remarked Andy, regarding the shaky-looking craft with disgust. "We'd be swamped before we got halfway there." "We can do better than that," said Bob. "We'll row over to yonder shore, which isn't more than half a mile away, and walk to town." "That's a pretty big walk, I'm thinking," grumbled Andy. "It is, but what else can we do?" "That's right. If we could walk the whole ways, I would sooner have done it," said Switzer, who preferred the land anyway to the water. Under Bob's directions, they lifted the flatboat on edge and dumped the water out that had accumulated in her. Then, after a great deal of trouble, they shoved her afloat. Each of the lads took a turn at the oars, for though the distance was short from this point of the island to the main shore, the boat was clumsy and made slow progress against the tide which was running out. It was after 10 o'clock when they landed.
They started for town following the shoreline, but had to go out of their way all of 2 miles in covering an indentation which butted in like a horseshoe. When they had gone halfway, they were stopped by a creek too deep to wade, and they had to follow it a mile before a rude bridge enabled them to cross. By the time they reached the vicinity of the mill, it was past midnight. The big brick structure, surrounded by its tall, whitewashed fence, loomed up before them, dark and silent. "Andy, you go to the police station and tell the officer in charge that Jim Flanders and Luke Sparrow are in this neighborhood and have designs on the mill tonight," said Bob. Andy immediately started on his errand. "Now, Jake, you go down to yonder corner of the fence and keep your eyes wide open for intruders. Those fellows will have to scale the fence to get inside the enclosure. If you see anything suspicious, come back and let me know." Bob, left alone, crouched down at the corner and kept a close watch on 2 sides of the mill property. It was not a bright night. The sky was overcast and a light mist hung in the air, making it difficult to see objects clearly at any distance. Presently Bob's heart gave a jump. 2 forms came slouching up the road. They passed within 2 yards of the boy without noticing him. Bob immediately identified them as Flanders and Sparrow. They sneaked along the fence, the boy creeping after them, till they came to the small gate beyond the engine house. Here they paused, and soon Bob heard the cracking of wood. The door was forced, and the rascals vanished inside the enclosure. The boy cautiously followed. Flanders and his pal knew their way like a book, and headed for a window opening into the packing room on the ground floor. The windows were not protected by bars, only the usual catch holding the sashes together. The catch of one of those windows was broken, and had not been repaired. Flanders and Sparrow knew about this, and they slunk up to that particular window. They raised the lower sash and entered, shutting it down again. Bob came up and tried to peer through the glass. All was dark inside. "That room is full of inflammable material," breathed the boy. "And those chaps know every nook and corner about the place. I must find that watchman." He ran quickly from point to point without seeing the night guardian. At length he reached the side door of the office. There he found the watchman seated on the step with his head against the jamb. He was snoring loudly. "Well, you're a pretty fellow to guard other people's property," cried the boy with a look of disgust. "Wake up!" he shouted in the man's ear, at the same time shaking him violently. The watchman didn't wake worth a cent. Bob bent down and caught the overpowering fumes of liquor from his mouth. "Intoxicated!" gasped Bob. "And at the moment when he's most wanted. What shall I do? The police won't be here for a while yet. 10 minutes will be enough time for those scoundrels to set a blaze that will finish the mill." Bob tried the side door and found it unlocked. He stepped over the watchman's inert body and entered the building. Then he removed his shoes and moved quietly in the direction of the packing room, where the danger threatened. He paused at the door and listened. He could hear nothing. With much caution he opened the door and entered. Then he could make out the 2 rascals moving about at one end of the room. Presently a match was struck, and soon little spurts of flame began to curl up around a pile of shavings and wood in the midst of a lot of empty cases. The peril of the building was imminent. Throwing every other consideration to the winds, Bob dashed forward with a wild whoop. The startled rascals darted for the window to escape, while Bob devoted his energies to trying to subdue the rising flames. Flanders then noticed that the boy was alone, and he stopped his companion's headlong rush with an oath. "It's only a boy," he grated to Sparrow. "Come back." They dashed at Bob like a pair of enraged tigers. He saw them coming and snatched up a stick of wood to defend himself. The light of the fire flashed in his face, and they recognized him. "You here?" roared Flanders with another oath. Both he and Sparrow staggered at the sight of the boy they thought safely secured on the island. "Yes, I'm here," replied Bob fearlessly. "And the police will be here in a moment, too." "They will, eh?" hissed Flanders. "Blast you for the interferer you are! I'll kill you this time if I never draw another breath." He tried to grapple with Bob, but the lad eluded his grasp. "Catch him, Sparrow, and brain him!" Sparrow seized a stick and struck at Bob. The boy warded off the blow, but its force sent him staggering against a pile of boxes. He slipped and went down.
Now we have 'em!" cried Flanders. The two rushed upon him when the boxes above that had been so rudely shaken toppled over and fell with a crash, burying the villains under them. Bob, half stunned, crawled out from under, the blood streaming from a nasty wound on his head. Flanders and Sparrow never made a move. Seeing the fire was beyond his efforts to subdue, Bob reeled out of the room, staggered to the door of the office, burst it in, ran to the telephone, and sent the alarm over the wires. Then he fainted away and was found there 5 minutes afterward when Andy and 3 policemen rushed into the building. The smoke was pouring through the place and the fire gaining great headway. An officer took the receiver from Bob's nerveless hand and sent the second message to the fire department. The packing room was a sea of flame when the fire companies reached the scene. By energetic action, the fire was confined to the basement and finally subdued. Bob was, in the meantime, revived and told his story. Manager Wells was aroused from his sleep and reached the mill in time to listen to it. "My brave boy," he said, "you certainly have saved the mill." Once more Bob Chambers became the hero of the hour. His desperate fight with Flanders and Sparrow, whose charred remains were found in the ruins of the packing room on the following day, was graphically reported in next morning's news, and set the whole town talking about the boy. A week later there was another meeting of the stockholders of the Bayport Woolen Mills, which public opinion through the Daily News forced Duncan Pritchard to call. At this meeting the wage question which had caused the strike was reconsidered, and the action of the previous meeting reversed. Manager Wells was ordered to dispense with the new hands and put all the old employees to work again, which he did at once, to the great satisfaction of all concerned. Bob Chambers was called before the stockholders' meeting, complimented in warm terms for his intrepid conduct, and presented with a check from the company for $5,000. The insurance companies holding risks on the mill combined in testifying their appreciation of the boy's splendid efforts toward saving the mill from destruction to the extent of a check for $1,000. The Boston papers published the story of the affair, giving Bob full credit for courage and presence of mind, and the majority of the New England papers reprinted the same, so that for some time the name of Robert Chambers became somewhat famous through that section of the country. Contrary to Bob's expectation, Dexter Pritchard did not go back on his word, but made good as a friend of the boy who had saved his life. Duncan Pritchard sent for Bob, expressed the gratitude he and Mrs. Pritchard felt for what he did for the family, and tried to force his check for $10,000 on the boy, which Bob politely but firmly refused to accept. Then Mr. Pritchard promoted him to an excellent position in the office of the mill, with the view to his ultimately filling the office of manager. A year later Bob became assistant to Manager Wells. It is generally understood by the friends of both the young people that Bob and Ruby will be married next spring, when the former attains his 19th year. While the strike of the Bayport Woolen Mills is a thing of the misty past, Bob always refers to it with pleasure as marking the beginning of his rise in life. The end. End of Chapter 16. End of A Rise in Life. Recording by Keith Salis.